All right, we are live. Good morning, everybody. I am Meagan Medick. This is Unreported on NewsNation. And have you been extremely bored with Congress, a sleepy Senate, and a snoozy House? Well, that is all going to change today. We are about 10 minutes out from a massive hearing on the Capitol Hill. We have Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former NIAID director. He is scheduled to testify before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. This is after he was subpoenaed by Senator Rand Paul. He was asked to come in voluntarily a couple months ago. Fauci ended up not coming. So Rand Paul said, guess what? You're on your way. So here we are today. I have an absolute all-star panel with me this morning. We are going to be watching live and reacting, and then we'll have a post-show. Well, I call it a show because Congress, can kind of be a little showy sometimes, but we will do a post-hearing analysis and break down what exactly is going on. We have Dr. Amesh. You probably know him. He was front and center on your television screens during the pandemic, informing the American people of what was going on. We also have trial lawyer Reagan Charleston Thomas. She is here. She is going to give us commentary about what actually are they saying that could be used in court. We also have legal analyst Bob Driscoll. He's coming in just a minute. His link is being funky. You guys know how the internet works, but he is here. He's amazing. He has firsthand experience with prepping witnesses for testimonies like this in Congress. So he's going to have a really hands-on view and analysis for you guys. But I need to give a little bit of backstory about what's going on and what we're actually going to be seeing today in this hearing. So I can promise you one thing, it's going to be fiery. Usually in the news, we kind of always say like reportedly and allegedly before we make big, broad statements because we're trying to protect ourselves. But I'm not going to say this before this next statement because it's so true. These guys do not like each other. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Dr. Anthony Fauci, not friends, not best buds. If you are following Rand Paul on X at all, you know that his whole feed has basically been a how can I blast Fauci for the past couple of months. But three big things they're going to be focusing on are the origins of COVID-19. Where did this virus actually come from? Where did it start? U.S. funding of coronavirus research and the connection there to Wuhan, and allegations surrounding federal record retention. A phrase that you are going to hear a lot today that we need to understand: gain of function research. That is at the center of this hearing. Gain of function research. These men have two very different definitions on what gain of function research is. It's key. So I'm just going to give you the broadest, simplest definition. Even my EP was like, that's it. I get it now. Gain of function research involves altering an organism, including a virus, so that it gains or enhances a biological function. Now, as I said, for years, Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Fauci, they have been arguing over these exact words, but they're using different definitions, which Reagan, our legal analyst, will help us understand. Isn't that the beauty of law? Everyone can argue their own definition in the court, and things can be ruled different ways. So Paul, he's arguing that NIH-funded research conducted through EcoHealth Alliance enhanced bat coronaviruses, making Fauci's repeated statements to Congress misleading or false. We have a graphic here. Fauci has consistently maintained under oath that the research did not meet the federal regulatory definition of gain of function, and that Senator Paul has been using a broader scientific definition. So this argument has fueled a lot of fiery exchanges between Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Fauci. Let's hear just a couple of those moments over the last couple of years.
I have never lied before the Congress. You are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain of function research in the Wuhan Institute.
You're simply saying it doesn't exist because you changed the definition on the NIH website. This is terrible, and you're completely trying to escape the idea that we should do something about trying to prevent a pandemic from leaking from a lab.
All right, a lot of accusations there, a lot of fire exchanges. We're expecting that today, and it's kind of exciting. We haven't seen anything go on in a long time, and we should want answers to what happened with this pandemic. Were the American people deceived? What does the medical community know? How does the medical community feel today? We're going to talk about all of that on the show and throughout this live stream. So just days ago, here's a big whopper that's been thrown in. Senator Paul has released what he says are Dr. Fauci's private pandemic diary entries. These documents that Paul argues says there's a different picture of what was being discussed privately inside the scientific community during the earliest weeks of the outbreak. One entry in particular has been receiving a lot of attention, as it should. I've got the full thing up on the screen for you, but I'm just going to read one highlighted part. This is from January 26th, 2020. In here it says, now we know the market was not the source, it was the amplifier. So as you could argue in court, and our legal analyst here will help us understand today, that doesn't conclude that it came from the lab. So he's not incriminating himself with that statement, but it is interesting. Dr. Fauci did also write that he believed the virus had likely jumped from animals to humans somewhere, but it raises important questions on what scientists believed privately during the very early days of the pandemic, January 2020, compared to what they were saying publicly to people. Another diary entry that might come up in today's hearing. According to documents, Dr. Fauci participated in an early February 2020 conference call with leading virologists to discuss the origin. His notes indicate there was a disagreement amongst the scientists, including whether there was deliberate insertion of genetic material, if that was possible, aka gain of function. This is on February 1st, 2020. I'll read a snippet of it. There was not total agreement about the likelihood of deliberate insertion. The rest felt that deliberate insertion was possible, and given the fact that Dr. Shi at the University of Wuhan had been working for years in gain of function in coronaviruses to allow adaptation of the spike protein to bind to the human ACE2 receptor. So a lot going on here. We've got a timeline of events that we can pop up on the screen so you can kind of get your bearings straight. It's a lot to take in. Couple of key points that we're going to making sure that we hit for you today on that, including the gain of function research, what was said in private versus what was said in public, and what Dr. Fauci says was not gain of function research, while Senator Paul says it was. Another issue we expect to hear repeatedly is whether Dr. Fauci simply followed the science, or whether, as Senator Paul alleges, he actively helped shape the narrative of what was happening scientifically in the public around COVID's origins, and the doctors he surrounded himself to push that narrative, whether true or false. Dr. Fauci obviously denies that. So to help us separate all of this politics from science and the law, as I said, we have an absolutely outstanding panel today. Bob, do we have Bob yet? There he is.
Hello, good morning.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Great.
Thank you so much for being here. You guys want to put the rest of the panel on the screen? All right, we have Dr. Amesh and we have Reagan Charleston Thomas. Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for being here today. What a monumentous day on Capitol Hill.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for
All right,
having me.
so we will start with you, Robert. This hearing is taking place because of a subpoena. This is not voluntary. There was a voluntary ask in place that did not come to fruition. So he has been subpoenaed. So legally speaking, what authority does Senator Paul actually have to take over this hearing?
The authority to subpoena any member of the public, frankly, before Congress is very broad. I mean, this is something we go over. I teach congressional investigations at Catholic University, and I'm going to look forward to using this as an example this fall. And in particular, this case is doubly fascinating because where Dr. Fauci has a pardon from President Biden, former President Biden, that he got on his way out the door, he probably won't have the ability to take the fifth if you were concerned about criminal prosecution, because there likely cannot be a criminal prosecution for everything or any federal law violation he may have violated while he was in office, essentially. And so Congress has broad authority to subpoena people. They'll probably have to answer the questions, and there'll be a back and forth of essentially Senator Paul trying to get him to repeat some of the things that are in his private diaries, and to then get him to say what he said publicly before, and to see if he can hang him up on making essentially a false statement to Congress or admitting that he wasn't being truthful in some of his prior public statements. So it's going to be a very interesting hearing. I'm kind of fascinated to see how the showdown plays out, because as you had said, the two of these folks definitely don't like each other. And I think it's going to be a lot of fireworks, probably more so than most congressional hearings.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Let's get to you, Dr. Amesh. You were watching the pandemic unfold, but you were also at the forefront of helping Americans understand day to day the numbers, the new regulations, things that were being put in place. It was evolving. It was a public health crisis in real time. That cannot be denied. Do you believe, looking back 6 years ago, that Dr. Fauci accurately represented what he knew at the time, or do you think there were moments when the public wasn't given the full picture?
What you have to keep in context is that this was a novel virus that wasn't known to humans before 2019. And in the early days, there was a lot of debate, and there continues to be debate about some critical issues that we don't have enough information on. How did this get into humans? Was it from experiments that were going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Was it from a wet market? And when you had massive lack of Chinese transparency, it's going to create an information vacuum. The answer to all of these questions is known by the Chinese government. So what we're doing is speculating about what the Chinese government does not want to disclose. They don't say it comes from a wet market. They don't say it comes from from one of their labs. But I think what you have to recognize is that everybody was grappling with these questions, trying to understand what was going on. This was a virus that we were learning about real time. And when you're in a position like Dr. Fauci is in, you're obviously going to have debates with other scientists. You're going to have your own personal hypotheses and conjectures, which might differ from what you're talking about when you're speaking to a policymaker who doesn't want to know about all of the back and forth that's going on in your mind. They want definitive answers. And I think sometimes that nuance disappears, and then somehow retrospectively people are saying, oh, well, there was uncertainty here, there was people hiding things. I don't think that was the case. All of us were writing and talking and thinking about all of the different hypotheses, but what you have to do when you're formulating policy is make it related to what the most likely scenario is, with all those caveats that things are going to change. And I think you also, as a scientist or a physician, you're always having an active mind, trying to incorporate new data and changing what you know, what you say based on actual data becoming accumulated. And I think that's part of what you see here. Do I agree with everything Dr. Fauci did? No. Do I think that there could have been more transparency and more nuance? Yes. But I don't think that this was any kind of malice or trying to hide things from people.
That same night, Governor Gavin,
you know what, you guys, it's starting. Let's listen in. Reagan, specifically, I want to know from you when this is over, what could be interpreted to actually take this in court?
Presidents, governors, mayors, school boards, corporations, and Congress all bear responsibility for the decisions they made. The COVID lockdown, however, could never have been inflicted without you aiding and abetting the crime. Children lost years of education. Small businesses built over a lifetime disappeared. Patients delayed cancer screenings and other medical care. Families were separated from dying relatives. Workers were ordered to accept a medical procedure or lose their jobs. Worship assembly, employment, education, and travel were restricted in the name of science. While you did not impose every restriction, you used your public authority to justify them. While you concluded publicly that COVID occurred naturally, your private record tells a different story. In early 2020, your hand-picked virologist warned that the virus appeared to have been manipulated in the lab. In a conference call concerning the origin of the virus, all but two of the participants believed deliberate insertion was possible. Your concern was not merely theoretical. That same week, you led an urgent effort to determine whether your own agency had funded the research related to these experiments that were now under suspicion. Hours later, your assistant reported that the Wuhan experiments had indeed been reviewed and approved by the NIH. Those were not the actions of officials who believed that a research-related origin was an absurd conspiracy theory. They were the actions of officials urgently trying to determine whether their agency funding was connected to the research under discussion, connected to the pandemic. You could not hide that your agency had funded the Wuhan research or your long history of defending gain-of-function research. The only alternative left was to argue that COVID-19 did not originate in the Wuhan lab. You were not a detached observer. You had an institutional interest in the public believing that federally funded research had nothing to do with the pandemic. It was a conflict of interest from the very beginning. The authors of the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2 privately had serious doubts about a natural origin. Within days, though, they flipped, and they all wrote in proximal origin that the virus was almost certainly not a laboratory construct. That paper was then used by the government and the media and you to discredit Americans who were asking the same questions that you and the authors were asking yourselves privately. You even cited proximal origin from the White House podium. You held it out as evidence that the virus could not have been engineered, but you didn't disclose your role in the discussions that preceded the writing of the paper. You did not disclose the author's original concerns. You did not reveal that you had been part of the paper, that you had read and offered editorial comments on the paper before it was published, before you began using it as evidence that it couldn't have originated in the lab. You did not disclose that you had immediately investigated yourself whether NIAID funding might be connected to the research. You did not tell the American people the full story. Duly released private messages indicate that the doubts with the authors and others didn't disappear after the publication. So while this was being waved at the White House to show that it couldn't come from the lab, the authors were still privately continuing to assign a meaningful probability to a laboratory origin, one thing in public and another in private. Some of the same scientists discussed avoiding email and carefully managing communications that might eventually be obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. The pattern is straightforward. Privately, there was alarm, then an immediate inquiry to see if NIAID's possible exposure to funding, then a rapid public declaration of certainty, continued private doubt, and then years of resistance to disclosure. The question is why? The only logical answer is that your primary concern was avoiding culpability. Your primary concern was hiding the fact that you had approved the funding for this dangerous research. Your support of gain-of-function research is extensive and long-standing. In 2011, your agency funded Ron Fauci's laboratory when it mutated the avian flu until it could spread through the air between mammals. This was the tipping point. This is when others became worried. You funded this. You advocated for this. The federal government's own biosecurity board, though, recommended withholding the details of these experiments because of the danger the research posed. People were concerned that publishing it was publishing a roadmap to creating bioweapons around the world. But you sided with the gain-of-function scientist Fauci and argued that the benefits of publishing the research far outweighed the risks. You defended this avian flu transmissibility experiments as critical research. You wrote that even if a scientist became infected and triggered a pandemic, the benefits of the gain-of-function experiments outweighed the risk. In 2014, your agency, NIAID, began funding the Wuhan bat coronavirus work. In 2015, Ralph Barrick and the Chinese scientist Shi Zhengli published NIAID-supported research combining a bat coronavirus spike protein with a SARS backbone. The resulting virus could infect human airway cells. It's a novel virus that now can infect human cells. It gained transmissibility, it gained function. In 2018, the same group of scientists, EcoHealth, Barrick, Shi, and their collaborators submitted the diffuse proposal, which involved the insertion of a furin cleavage site into the coronavirus. DARPA rejected it as too dangerous. When COVID was sequenced, though, early on in January of 2020, within days, scientists discovered that, lo and behold, it had a novel furin cleavage site, just as had been proposed in the diffuse project. This was either an extraordinary coincidence or a smoking gun, evidence that the Chinese had created COVID-19. It made the laboratory origin question more legitimate, and it made your categorical public denials indefensible. On May 11th, 2021, you told the Senate, the NIH has never, ever, and does not now fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. When I gave you the opportunity to correct the record, to reconsider the statement, you responded that you had never before lied to Congress. We were then told that only the government's narrowest regulation of definition counted here, that you could define gain of function in one way in which this wasn't gain of function, in which all of the common sense of the world would be thrown out, all of the idea that the mice were dying and the virus was more transmissible didn't matter because you had a technical definition that allowed you to fund it. But the real question is, was it dangerous? Was it a wise decision to fund this? And you haven't deviated from that. You've never admitted that it could have been a mistake funding this research in China. The American people weren't asking for a semantics debate over what is gain of function. They were asking, does common sense say this research was dangerous in Wuhan? They wanted to know whether their money-funded experiments in Wuhan that made bat coronaviruses better able to infect humans. The answer is yes. They wanted to know whether NIAID adequately supervised their work. The answer is no. When you defended this research, you described its benefits in the broadest terms. But when Congress demanded accountability, you hid behind the narrowest possible definition. You can't have it both ways. Your conduct concerning federal records raises further questions. It is a crime to destroy federal records. Yet our investigation reveals your assistant diligently reported that she deleted tons of emails. In 2024, you testified that you did not delete federal records. Who's telling the truth? You or your assistant? The committee has obtained repeated instructions from you telling federal officials to delete communications. On February 2nd, 2020, one day after Origin's call, you told Francis Collins, please delete this email after you read it. The committee asked for your voluntary cooperation to come today. Your appearance had to be compelled by subpoena. You're here today under duress. You're here today because of the court ordering it. President Biden issued you a sweeping pardon extending back to 2014, the same pardon he gave to his son Hunter. A pardon may protect a person from criminal prosecution, doesn't rewrite history. It does not erase documents. It does not convert a misleading statement into a truthful one. And it does not prevent Congress from establishing what happened. There will be another pandemic. There will be another crisis. And there will again be officials who insist that uncertainty must be hidden for the public's own good. They will demand obedience. They will invoke science. I am the science, as though it were a commandment. They will argue that government officials cannot be questioned because questioning them would undermine public trust. They have it backwards. It is secrecy that destroys trust. It is arrogance that destroys trust. It is censorship that destroys trust. And it is the refusal to admit error that destroys trust. That loss of trust may be your most damaging legacy. Trust can't be ordered. It has to be earned. No scientist is above scrutiny. No government official is beyond accountability. And no public servant has the right to treat the suffering of millions of Americans as a footnote to his preferred version of history. I now recognize Senator Peters for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee has a long and a very proud history of conducting serious oversight on behalf of the American people. When this committee has been at its best, Democrats and Republicans have worked together to investigate complicated issues, to follow the facts wherever they may lead, and produce recommendations that actually strengthen our nation's security and improve government functions. That bipartisan tradition has produced meaningful work following Hurricane Katrina, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, failures at the Secret Service, and countless other matters. Unfortunately, today's hearing is the latest step in the chairman's sharp departure from that long tradition. This hearing appears to be a culmination of months of biased and selected efforts by the majority under the guise of a committee investigation to basically legitimize a predetermined conclusion that was reached years ago. In 2021, the chairman has called for today's witness to be fired, to be arrested, accused him of leading cover-ups and conspiracies. He has even featured the witness prominently in fundraising emails and on the cover of his book. He has also called for the cancellation of the witness's security detail, despite the fact the witness and his family have received numerous credible death threats. When I served as chairman, Senator Paul and I launched a bipartisan biosecurity investigation that included oversight of risky research and the origins of COVID-19, because we agreed that the committee's work would be stronger if we did it in a bipartisan manner and just followed the facts. That was and continues to be an area of legitimate and certainly needed oversight. As chairman, Senator Paul has taken the opposite approach. He has abandoned longstanding practice by blocking minority participation in committee oversight actions and has chosen to selectively release committee records that the minority has never had any access to in order to support his pre-drawn conclusions. The chairman has repeatedly excluded committee's minority and withheld documents and evidence from members that are entitled to receive them, disregarding longstanding Senate rules and committee precedent that have preserved the credibility of our oversight in this committee for decades. I have raised these concerns directly with the chairman because it's not just what we investigate that matters, but how we conduct that investigation. That also matters. One-sided investigations designed to validate predetermined conclusions do not serve the American people who sent us to actually uncover the truth and to solve problems. I wrote to the chairman requesting that he adhere to committee rules. But instead of addressing concerns that I raised, he removed part of the committee's website from the public view. This move not only prevented the public from being able to view those lists of concerns, it adds serious questions about the desire for transparency and legitimate oversight of this matter. But what makes today's hearing particularly disappointing is not simply the chairman's actions, but what we could be using this committee's true and time oversight responsibilities to accomplish. This committee has not held its annual threats hearing at all in this Congress. We have not held a budget hearing for the Department of Homeland Security. There are important hearings that we would have the opportunity to discuss as to how to strengthen our Homeland Security across the board. No hearings on those topics. Instead of focusing on the national security challenges that we are facing in our country right now, today's hearing looks backwards, revisiting questions this committee has already examined, including through bipartisan work that Senator Paul and I conducted together when I served as chairman of this committee. But rather than building on that work to strengthen our preparedness against future disasters, we are instead relitigating the past. COVID-19 exposed serious deficiencies in our nation's public health infrastructure. We know that. More than 1 million Americans lost their lives, and this committee should absolutely continue to examine how we can better prepare our nation against future biological threats. Those are the kinds of forward-looking, life-saving questions that will help our nation be better prepared to protect the health and the safety of Americans when the next emergency occurs. Unfortunately, at this precise moment, we should be strengthening our capabilities. The Trump administration seems to be doing everything in their power to actually weaken our capabilities. The administration has hollowed out the public health workforce. They have fired, pushed out, and cut funding for public health personnel, shrinking the CDC workforce by a quarter. Thousands of experienced scientists have left government service, and with them has gone critical institutional knowledge that cannot be easily replaced, certainly not quickly replaced. The administration, thanks to political operatives like Russell Vought, has slashed or illegally withheld funding for life-saving medicines and cutting-edge technologies that let us rapidly develop them during an emergency. Mr. Vought is now further politicizing the federal grant-making process, proposing to subject all federal grants, including those for disaster relief, housing development, and cancer research, to the whims of political appointees, not nonpartisan experts. All of this has left the American people more vulnerable to infectious disease threats. And we are already tragically seeing the consequences. Staffing and funding cuts have slowed the federal, state, and local response to ongoing outbreak of a foodborne parasite, which has sickened thousands in my home state of Michigan, as well as across the country. At the same time, the administration cuts to global health programs and international partnerships have greatly reduced our ability to contain dangerous diseases like Ebola before they spread to our shores. We should be examining whether our federal health agencies have the personnel and the resources they need to effectively prevent, detect, and respond to these threats. We should be asking how to strengthen our biodefense efforts to deter our adversaries and prevent biological attacks against our country, and how our government can better coordinate and communicate during public health emergencies. These are the kinds of forward-looking matters that are worthy of this committee's time. Instead, we are here continuing the chairman's year-long focus on one individual. History tells us, unfortunately, another pandemic is all but inevitable. The question is whether Congress and this committee will work to better prepare our country for it, or continue looking backward while our public health infrastructure crumbles around us. That is the hearing that we should be having today. Unfortunately, I fear the intent of this hearing is only meant to further a purely partisan agenda and it will not make Americans safer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, that was Democrat Senator Gary
The
Peters, his
accusation
opposition to
that The
Fauci.
committee has denied access to the minority to records is categorically false. This is the most transparent investigation in the history of Congress. We actually created a website and we put all of the information on the website. It continues to operate. The reason it hasn't been accessed is no Democrat ever signed up for it. Not one Democrat. We told them the access. They never asked for the access code. They haven't been on the website because they have not cared about the investigation. It's a practice of this committee to swear in the witness. Dr. Fauci, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
All right, he is now
Dr.
under oath.
Anthony Fauci, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Member Peters, members of the committee, I served at the NIH for over 54 years, 38 of those as director of the National Institute of Virology and Infectious Diseases. Over that period, I proved that I believe in and respect the value of legitimate congressional oversight. In fact, I testified before and/or briefed Senate and House Senate and House committees well over 200 times over those 38 years. During and after the COVID pandemic, I have appeared multiple times for hearings in the Senate and the House, usually under oath, and sat for several days-long transcribed sworn interviews, answering questions about the very issues that are now the subject of this hearing. However, given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars, unquote. Any reasonable person who has followed his unhinged obsession with me would readily come to the same conclusion. Therefore, although it pains me to do so, because of the respect I have for the legislative branch of government and my decades-long record of cooperating with Congress, under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
Wow.
We will now begin a round of questioning. Dr. Fauci, your testimony today is compelled by a lawful subpoena. As you know, it's a crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 to knowingly make a material false statement to Congress, with a penalty up to 5 years of imprisonment. Understanding that you are under oath, the American people would like to understand your reasoning, your rationale for why you chose to fund the research in Wuhan. There have been, intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the DOE, have all come to the conclusion that more likely than not, the virus came from the lab in Wuhan. And so we'd like to know, what was the rationale? What was the discussion? How, what went behind the decision to fund the research in Wuhan? How did you come to the conclusion that a totalitarian country would be capable of doing this in a BSL-2 lab, a lab that lacked the security? What was the reasoning? And are you sorry, basically, for making the decision? Would you, given another chance, say, well, gosh, circumstances now, as I know it, maybe it wasn't a wise thing. Can you explain to the committee why you chose to fund this dangerous research in China?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
Bob, I want to bring you in here.
In the red
quickly.
folder on your
Seems like
table
he's going to plead the
is
fifth the
a
entire
copy
time.
of
Is
Section
that wise? Is that what you would
192 of
advise?
Title II of the U.S. Code. Your counsel has been provided a copy as well. That section makes it a crime for a witness appearing under subpoena to refuse to answer any questions pertinent
Go ahead, Mr.
to the
Driscoll.
question under inquiry. Do you have that in front of you?
Let's unmute him, guys.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the
You guys,
Constitution.
Mr. Driscoll,
Let
is
the
muted.
record
Let's unmute
record
him
that
really quick so he
the
can give us some.
witness has
some
refused
insight
to
into
answer
pleading the
whether
fifth
there's
here.
a folder in front of him based on his Fifth Amendment right. It is true that you're appearing under direction of our subpoena to provide testimony on matters under consideration by the committee, including the origins of COVID-19,
Bob, you muted
risky
yourself
life
from your
sciences
computer. If you can
research, and your
unmute.
tenure as a federal
Don't worry,
government
it's just you.
employee.
Just live stream.
Additionally, you've been
There we go.
provided a full and
There you are.
unconditional
Sorry.
pardon.
I
So he's
just
pleading
want
the
to
fifth.
say,
January 9th.
there's a legal
18th,
debate about whether or not
2025
you can
for
plead the
any
fifth in this
offenses
circumstance,
against the United
because
States which
you
may
can
have
plead
been
the
committed or
fifth to
taken
preserve
part
your right against
from January
self-incrimination.
1st, 2014.
But if there's no
to
risk
the
of
date of the
prosecution,
pardon
you don't
for a
have
10-year
that.
period.
You don't have that right necessarily. The legal theories
Arising
attorneys
from
are
or
using
any matter
essentially
related to
is
service as director of the
that
National
he's pleading the
Institute
fifth related to
for Allergy and
future
Infectious
false
Diseases,
statements he might
as a
be
member of the
accused of
White House
making.
Coronavirus
It's kind of a
Task Force,
difficult argument
or
because
the
if you
White
tell
House
the truth, you can't be
COVID-19
prosecuted for a false statement.
Advisory
But he's essentially arguing that, well, the committee's operating in bad faith, Senator Paul's operating in bad faith, and so because I don't trust the committee to not accuse me of making a false statement going forward today, I'm going to assert the fifth to every question. And it's it's the kind of thing to advise a witness to do. It's going to be a blow politically and PR wise, because what we're going to see now is essentially now anyone on the committee, majority, they can accuse him of kidnapping the Lindbergh child, and he's going to have to plead the fifth. And so the questions will just be loaded up at this point, really leading questions, really damaging questions, and he's going to have to plead the fifth to every one of them because you can't selectively invoke the fifth. And so now he's going to have to just sit here and take it for a while. And I guess his attorneys thought that the risk of a false statement prosecution was too great, so they instruct him to plead the fifth. But and I guess that could be valid advice, but he's certainly going to take a public hit throughout this hearing.
All right, let's listen in just a little bit more of Dr. Paul, and then Reagan, I want to ask you a question about the Fifth Amendment upholding his pardon.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, did the CIA ever transfer funds to NIH under an interagency agreement?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, did the NIH ever conduct research for or in coordination with any element of the intelligence community, CIA, ODNI?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
The reason why these questions are important is, President Trump has done a ban, and we're glad that he did a ban on gain-of-function research. So we're better off than we were when we had an advocate serving as head of NIAID, an advocate for gain-of-function research. There is still, though, a question, though, whether or not the intelligence community is adhering to that order. There's a question of whether or not gain-of-function research is still ongoing. And these are important questions the American people deserve to know. Dr. Fauci, have you been read into any classified Department of Homeland Security program, any prospective special access program concerning gain-of-function research?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
When we look at the research in China, the gain-of-function research that you've denied was gain-of-function, one of the things that startled the scientists when they saw COVID in the first couple of weeks was when they looked at the sequence of it, they said, oh my God, there's a furin cleavage site in it. And in this particular family of coronaviruses, the sarbecoviruses, they'd never seen this before. They were also startled to look at it and see how it was coded for, what the codons were, and to discover that the codons used out of 36 different possibilities turned out to be the one that was commonly used in gene manipulation by scientists. Dr. Fauci, were the scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology capable of inserting a furin cleavage site into a coronavirus?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
So we're going to be hearing that a lot. He's going to be pleading the Fifth this entire time. All these questions, he's going to plead the Fifth. Meagan, you are a trail attorney. We know that Dr. Anthony Fauci had a
SARS virus that,
pardon, I think it dates back to all of his actions starting in 2014. Is this legally in court the right thing to do? Because anything he said previously under oath can now not be punishable in a court of law.
And stick it on a backbone.
So, I think this was a bit unexpected. I was not anticipating this this morning. I'm not sure that many were. We were considering and discussing whether the pardon would be valid as to the testimony that's offered today. I know that there were arguments made about the scope and the specificity of that pardon as it relates to his invoking his Fifth Amendment right today. It's going to be interesting. I mean, I think this is going to set the stage for some very incredible legal arguments to be made on both sides. And, as earlier remarked, this is going to be a PR nightmare for Dr. Fauci after he starts getting leveled with the questions that are coming today.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, I can see it from his perspective. He doesn't want to potentially incriminate himself. But if you have nothing to hide, why would you plead the Fifth?
Well, and that's the issue here is that the potential liability, criminal liability for statements made today, and those statements made after the pardon was issued, that was kind of the gray area. And so it's curious that he's going to invoke his Fifth Amendment across the board today and open himself up to exactly the perspective that you just shared and articulated.
Absolutely. Let's listen in a little bit more to see what they are peppering him with that we won't get an answer to.
On a political, website, you don't really see this in science. But when they release this as being a conspiracy theory, we're wondering that when you do this, when you combine these viruses and are able to grow them in humanized cells, whether or not this kind of risky research, whether you call it gain of function or not, whether you use the definition of gain of function, whether this kind of research should have had more scrutiny. I think in your House testimony, you testified that you never traveled to China and that you were unaware that anybody at NIH ever examined the labs, that you trusted the Chinese scientists. I think you said that even recently, that with your discretion, you trusted the Chinese scientists. The problem is that even in our country, we trust our scientists. They're good American scientists, probably doing the right thing for America. But at the same time, we oversight to make sure it's not dangerous research, but we also investigate the lab. I believe Fort Detrick was one of our main labs was closed down in the last year or two because of, research institute, a research incident that was dangerous with dangerous pathogens. And so the American people would want to know, how could you approve this dangerous research in China, say that you trusted the Chinese scientists, and then in the end, you had to admit that you'd never been there and none of your inspectors had ever been there. Dr. Fauci, had any of the labs where this dangerous research was occurring, were any American lab oversight or lab investigators, did they ever appear in these labs to make sure that they were safe labs?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
So one of the main theories for
Dr.
those
I do
who
want to jump in
looked
here
at
and ask you a
this
little
being
bit
created
about
in the lab
gain of
was
function.
the
Here,
idea
this is at
that
the center
it could
of
come from
today's
a
hearing,
virus
like I
not
said at the top.
previously published.
We know
Dr.
that it's
Fauci, are you
risky.
aware
Gain of
that
function research
Dr.
is
Shi,
risky.
who
It
works
is
for the
literally
Wuhan Institute of
altering
Virology,
an organism. So Paul is saying here, we do have good American scientists doing the right thing. How could Dr. Fauci prove that research? How do you personally feel about gain of function research taking place inside America or around the world?
So when you're trying to do and predict pandemics, predict what pathogens have the ability to cause pandemics, you kind of have to understand what the roadblock is. So if you're talking about a flu virus, why isn't it spreading efficiently between humans the way it might do during birds? So unlocking those secrets is part of how we prepare. And I think gain of function research is dangerous. It has to be done at the appropriate biosafety levels with the appropriate personnel security to make sure that there's no accidents, that no one nefariously walks out with a vial of something. But I do think it is important research, but it has to be done right with the appropriate oversight.
Upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
the one research project that we do know you did fund is the one that Ron Fauci did. It's important to talk about because this sort of was the beginning of the debate over gain of function. This wasn't just me. I wasn't even aware of the debate 10 years ago. This was other scientists. Over 200 scientists at the Cambridge Working Group signed a protest because they didn't think you should fund the research and they didn't think it should even be published because it was sort of a roadmap as to how to make a bioweapon. So what they did was the avian flu, and this is important. It may be the most important question we
Exactly
get
to your
here
point
today.
right here, Dr. Amish.
The avian flu has about 50% mortality for humans. The good news, though, about animal viruses is they don't infect humans very well. It will infect humans, but doesn't go human to human very well. Ron Fauci, with the money that you provided to him, did an experiment where he caused purposeful mutations to create a new virus, an avian flu that didn't just infect birds well, but actually infected mammals well, went ferret to ferret in an aerosolized manner. People saw this and were aghast, at the decision-making process that you decided to fund this. But this is when, the debate came about and you wrote in support of this in the Washington Post and you said, even if a scientist is bitten, even if a pandemic should occur, the knowledge is worth the risks. Do you still stand by that? Would you like to qualify at all whether or not the knowledge of gain of function is worth the risks, particularly in this case, since we now know 15 million people died worldwide? Many people believe this came from the lab. Do you think that the risks really are worth the benefits for gain of function research?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
All right. We're going to finish with this question. And it's based really on that statement, that general statement in your support for gain of function, the idea that the benefits outweigh the risks. So there are many other people who disagree, and they aren't politicians or not. I don't know what party they're in. David Relman is probably one of the most esteemed. And he is a scientist at Stanford. He, I think, has classified clearance. He's been a consultant to our government probably for a decade or more. And he's written about this publicly. He says the opposite, He said that the risks of this research do not outweigh the benefits. He said the risks, we shouldn't do it. Richard Ebright, who's been involved in this debate for 2 decades, says the same thing. We really shouldn't be doing this at all. There's a quote also by, if the Kevin Esfelt quote is that at the very end. Kevin Esfelt, who's a CRISPR scientist at MIT, also wrote about this gain of function. I implore every scientist, funder, and nation working in the field, please stop. No more trying to discover or make pandemic-capable viruses. No more experiments likely to disseminate blueprints for plagues. Dr. Fauci, would you like to at least answer this one question for us today and let us know whether or not you've changed your mind on whether or not the benefits of gain-of-function research outweigh the risks?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
The chairman has denied your assertion of privilege and directed you to answer, but you nonetheless refuse and stand on privilege despite the existence of the pardon. The committee will have to consider after this hearing what appropriate action should be taken against you for the failure to testify after being directed to do so. It's against the law to obstruct an investigation of Congress. There will be repercussions to your refusal to testify today. Senator Peters. You're not recognized. You're not recognized. If you are unruly, you will be removed from the proceeding. You are not recognized, and you are not recognized, sir. Sir, you are not recognized. You are not recognized. Security, we'll hold off, but you will respect these proceedings. You were told not to sit at the table. You insist on sitting at the table, and we told you you would not be recognized. You are not invited here for testimony, sir. You are being disruptive. Would you behave this way in a courtroom? No, because the judge would put you in jail. I can't do that today, but I can have you escorted from the premises. So I would say, sir, sit quietly and don't say another word. I said, sit quietly. You are not recognized. Another word and you're gone.
All right. So there seems like there's somebody out there in the audience who is acting unruly, and Senator Rand Paul obviously was fired up for today and ready to go.
He is not recognized by the committee or the chair. If he speaks again, he will be removed from the room. This testimony is from Anthony Fauci. This is not a game with his lawyers. He can advise, his lawyers can give him advice. He's got a half dozen here. They're all allowed to talk to him.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. But the attorneys are not recognized. In fact, the attorney was told not to sit at the table, and he's not obeying that recommendation. There's a row behind you, sir. That's where you were told to sit, and you're not. And now you're disrupting the proceedings. And so, look, this is the way Anthony Fauci wants to be remembered, for a lawyer not listening to the rules. That's the way you want to be remembered, and that's what you're going to do. You are not recognized, sir. Security, please remove him from the room.
There we go. Applause across the board. Yeah. All right, I'm just kind of waiting to see.
State that Dr. Fauci will still have the advice of the other half a dozen attorneys that he brought along today. Senator Peters.
There we go, Senator Gary Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The COVID-19 pandemic is not the first or the last public health crisis to impact our nation. In December 2022, I released a report that identified significant failures in our federal government's preparedness and initial response to COVID-19. This report contained 17 key findings. It's a very large report, which I have right here. It contains 17 key findings and corresponding recommendations, including the need to invest in sustainable domestic manufacturing capabilities for critical medical supplies, build the infrastructure needed to surge testing capacity for infectious diseases, and robustly fund public health emergency preparedness and responses across all levels of government. Unfortunately, multiple administrations, including the current Trump administration, have failed to fund or to reform our health preparedness. This is something that I would hope the committee in the future would investigate. It needs to be taken a look at. It also feels like a new public health threat is hitting us every month. There's a foodborne parasite affecting thousands of people in Michigan and across the country, and our federal agencies still haven't fully pinned down the source of that outbreak. Measles cases in this country are at the highest they've been in 35 years. More children are getting sick and even hospitalized from this preventable disease. Over 1,000 people have died from the Ebola virus in Africa, and we don't know how widespread this crisis actually is. We have a hantavirus scare on a cruise ship, and though it hasn't made headlines in the way that the screwworm threatening our food security has, I remain concerned about bird flu that is also spreading and could one day cause a pandemic. This is also something this committee should be investigating and holding hearings on. Since January 2025, the Trump administration has taken a number of actions to drastically weaken our ability to fight infectious diseases and biological threats that endanger Americans. These actions are both incomprehensible and are also inexcusable. They include slashing funding for public health and infectious disease research, canceling contracts for cutting-edge vaccine technology, shutting agencies responsible for tackling infectious diseases around the world, firing thousands of federal employees with keeping our communities and our medicines and our food supply safe, and injecting political appointees in what should be non-political grant-making functions. That is something this committee should be looking at. I could go on. I could go on all the topics that we need to be looking at moving forward to protect this country. We're not doing that in this committee. That's what this committee was designed to do. It's what it has done throughout history. It has done it in a bipartisan way. We should get back to that and think about the future of this country and keeping this country safe. When a crisis like COVID-19 strikes, we have an obligation to examine what went right and what went wrong to provide accountability for the American people. Congress certainly has done that. Between the House and Senate, nearly 20 different committees, including this committee, as I mentioned, have conducted oversight of the COVID-19 pandemic, conducting transcribed interviews, holding dozens of hearings, and released more than 10 reports. Today's exercise, unfortunately, is a stark departure from those largely bipartisan, legitimate efforts. The chairman has shut the minority out of participating equally in these efforts, withheld information, selectively released documents, actions that completely undermine the credibility of this investigation. I will enter a record without objection, Mr. Chairman, a letter that I sent to you that detailed all of those areas that we have concern with and where we were shut out.
Without objection.
We'll provide other details as well. I think today's hearing unfortunately does real damage. It's tempting to turn one person into the scapegoat for a crisis that hundreds of officials across both the Trump and the Biden administration were responsible for handling. And it does so in a way that people that are facing death threats. This is only going to unfortunately deter other scientific experts from public service to understand that this is what they would have to go through as they provide their advice to us. We're not going to make our nation safer, and I hope that we can restore by doing these kinds of activities, and I hope that we can restore our legitimate bipartisan oversight that's going to help strengthen our public health and pandemic preparedness and other homeland priorities. That's what this committee needs to focus on. It hasn't the last year and a half. Let's hope it does in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, I hope the American people listen very carefully to Chairman Paul's opening statement. I think it's a stunning indictment of the actions you've taken that have been so destructive to global health. I certainly understand why you needed a pardon. I certainly understand why, on the advice of counsel, you're not answering any questions, because I think it'd be almost impossible for you to answer the questions truthfully without really demonstrating what you did, your culpability, self-incriminating. We have, all of us has prepared a lot. I've been deluged with questions to ask Dr. Anthony Fauci. There are so many legitimate questions that deserve answers, and now you're not willing to provide those answers. So with my limited time, I'm going to talk about things that my investigation have revealed that have not been adequately answered, and quite honestly, haven't been adequately covered by the legacy media. I'll kind of combine the questions into kind of one, but you know, I certainly, let's put up the last COVID chart. I was warned pretty early on about the dangers of the experimental gene therapy that you've called a vaccine, but it really falls under the definition of gene therapy. So I was going to ask you, I mean, were you carefully monitoring the safety surveillance systems like VAERS and vSafe that literally were deluged with complaints? You know, currently, worldwide, there have been almost 1.7 million adverse events reported to the VAERS system. Of those, over 39,000 were deaths. And of those deaths, 24% occur on the day of vaccination within 1 or 2 days. 24%, which, by the way, just happens to be the same percentage that a Rasmussen poll pointed out. The American public believe 24% of the American public believe they know somebody who died of the experimental gene therapy. So again, I was certainly interested in asking you whether or not you were following this as carefully as I was. It's not my responsibility to follow safety surveillance systems, but I did. And by the way, when I published, this is actual government information. When I published it and people had me on their shows, they would be censored by Facebook. They would be deplatformed. I think largely at the behest of the actions you took to make sure that disinformation wasn't spread. This wasn't disinformation. This was the truth. So I was going to ask you whether you knew Dr. Marks. I think you do know him. He's the head of CBER. He's the man who is in charge of approving vaccines and surveilling for the safety. My investigation shows that on March 1st of 2021, less than 3 months after the emergency use authorizations, he was warned by Dr. Anna Scharsman, data mining expert, that the algorithm they were using to analyze VAERS data was going to hide in mass safety signals. 26 days later and 3 months consecutively after that, they did data runs with a new algorithm that unmasked those safety signals. They showed dozens of safety signals, including sudden cardiac death, cerebral artery occlusion, basal ganglia stroke, agonal rhythm, Bell's palsy, and pulmonary infarction. Your diaries now show that you actually suffered pulmonary infarction in, I think, probably June 2021. I was just wondering whether it ever went through your mind that maybe that injection, all those boosters you took, might have caused that. You know, and the question I was going to, and I'll ask this question: were you ever made aware of the fact that Peter Marks was warned that the algorithm was going to hide the safety signals? And were you told that senior FDA officials were given shown dozens of safety signals associated with the COVID injection?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Next area I want to go through is in that same month of March 2021, an employee at NIH, Dr. Nath, led a team of researchers who were diagnosing and treating individuals who'd never had COVID but were severely injured by the genetic therapy injections. Dr. Nath told those individuals, stay quiet. We want to make sure that we gather all the information and then release it to doctors so they can treat people like yourself. There was a concerted effort, and I'll enter this in the record. It appears inside NIH to quash Dr. Nath's publishing that study. It finally was put on a preprint server with telling no one, and I think about May of 2022. I think what's noteworthy about this is Dr. Nath told the injured participants that early treatment, early intervention was crucial for them to be treated. And yet within the NIH, they were questioning what was Dr. Nath doing. They didn't want to publish that because, and I want to take time searching for it, because publishing it would create vaccine hesitancy, which is what we continue to hear time and time again, is the reason they didn't promote they lied about the safety signals they were seeing. Throughout the pandemic, I always pushed early treatment. We've got things in here where you were really concerned about remdesivir because it was untested, but hydroxychloroquine, yeah, it was an approved drug. Maybe some safety issues, but we had a great deal of experience with it. All of a sudden, you had the Surgisphere study. It was retracted within 2 weeks because it was completely false. Totally blew up the use of hydroxychloroquine. And then when it comes to ivermectin, which, by the way, because I was contacted by so many people, I referred them to doctors who actually had the courage and compassion to treat vaccine-injured individuals. It works. But I was going to ask you whether you were involved in the FDA attack on ivermectin. You had a interview on CNN on August 29th of 2021, where, again, I just don't want to take time to find the exact quote, but you said there's no evidence that ivermectin is helpful. On that exact same day, and I've got the studies right here. There was a website that was tracking the random controlled studies. Here they are, showing 60, 70% efficacy of ivermectin. The same day you say there's no evidence, there was all kinds of evidence. Loved ones had to go to hospitals, had to sue hospitals. Just, would you try it? So I would want to know, to what extent were you involved in sabotaging hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and did you do that because you knew the only way you get an emergency use authorization for these drugs, these experimental gene therapy, was if there was no effective treatment, you couldn't get the emergency use authorization. So is that why you helped sabotage these cheap generic drugs in favor of remdesivir, which, by the way, nurses, are you aware of the fact that nurses called it run, death is near?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
But let me end on this note, because this just came to light. We've got 11 million pages of documents. We also have other people who were in the room. But now we know you actually lied to your own diary. On March 27, 2020, you wrote in your diary, "To my surprise yesterday, the POTUS sent a letter to governors outlining a plan to reopen county by county while monitoring the spread of virus in the low-risk counties. This was half-baked and never shown to Deb or I before it was sent out." So we have evidence that, in fact, you were fully aware of it and certainly approved it, if not authored it. So I was just simply asking, is that true? Did you literally lie to your own diary? Did you know of that letter sent out to governors about reopening county by county? Again, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask you to ask the witness to just answer that one simple question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you. Dr. Fauci, I want to start by thanking you for more than 50 years of service to this country at the National Institutes of Health. And it is unfortunate that you have been put in the position that you are in today. And it must be enormously frustrating to know that this hearing is designed to entrap you. It must be very frustrating for your attorneys to hear the chair's mischaracterization of the legal issues and posture that impact your decisions at the witness table today. Meanwhile, I was going to ask you a series of questions about things that are relevant right now to the people of the United States about the state of public health in this country. Since President Trump took office in 2025, more than 4,500 cases of measles have been reported. That is more cases in the year and a half since Donald Trump has been president than were reported from 2000 to 2024 combined. Children are dying because there has been increased vaccine hesitancy fueled by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and frankly, his entire administration. Thousands of people in the United States of America have been sickened by a food-borne parasite, and the outbreak is nowhere near under control, as staffing at the FDA and other critical public health entities has been slashed by Russell Vought and Elon Musk. Last year, the National Institutes of Health awarded 201 fewer grants compared to the previous years. 207, I am corrected, compared to previous years. As those grants were either canceled or delays, especially at the beginning of the Trump administration, I can tell my colleagues what the impact was on people in New Hampshire, on scientists in New Hampshire, on clinical trials in New Hampshire, where people's cancer treatment was interrupted because Elon Musk and Russell Vought know better, they say, than the people at NIH about what to fund. And because they did some sort of word search, it seems, for some of the grants, and boy, oh boy, if you were studying rural health in New Hampshire and trying to understand how to better engage people who need health care in rural America, that was off the table. America is losing researchers and scientists to other countries because researchers and scientists, highly trained, highly qualified, invested in often by the American taxpayer, are finding the hostility from this administration so strong that it interferes with their science, and they want to pursue science wherever that science takes them. I also sit on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. We have had a number of hearings with nominees recently to fill critical spots. One of those nominees is Dr. Erica Schwartz, a brilliant woman, medical degree, biomedical engineering degree. I think she also told us she has a law degree and a master's in public health. She was a 2-star admiral in the United States Navy, an experienced doctor. And yet, when I asked her if she would push back at Secretary Kennedy, if he instructed her to suspend the promotion of the flu vaccine as he did some point in the last few months, there's an email to prove it, she couldn't answer that question. She either could not, would not, or had been bullied into evading a question about whether she, as the director of CDC, would stand up to Secretary Kennedy, the most unqualified Secretary of Health and Human Services this country has ever seen, and more than unqualified, somebody who pursues conspiracy theories, degrades people with disabilities, and continues to promote disproved science. That's the state of healthcare and public health in this country right now, not to mention the $1 trillion or so of cuts to the Medicaid program that is decimating healthcare in my state and decimating it around the country, not to mention the refusal of my colleagues and this administration to extend critical tax cuts for people who are trying to afford insurance on the Affordable Care Act. I just was at one of my community health clinics, and they are reporting fewer and fewer people coming in for care, disrupting care because they can no longer afford health insurance. And that is impacting, of course, the revenue stream to the community health clinic, their ability to hire and pay people, their ability to take care of their community. That's what I wish we were having hearings about in this committee and in the Health Committee. That's what I wish we were trying to address in a bipartisan way. But instead, we are here in an attempt to entrap you because you had a distinguished career trying to put Americans' public health first. With that, I yield.
Senator Lankford.
Chairman, thank you. Dr. Fauci, thanks for coming today. I know you're invoking your Fifth Amendment right, which you have the right to be able to do constitutionally, but thanks for coming to be a part of this. There are a lot of issues and a lot of questions that have come up, and hopefully in some day in the future, we'll be able to get all this clarity to be able to pull together. There were over 1 million Americans that died from COVID. You know that well. You were tracking the numbers literally every single day, those affected and those that died from the earliest days. There are a lot of lessons that we've got to learn from this, that we should put into history to be able to determine what happens in the future. How do we respond in the future? How do we deal with something like this again? It was uncharted territory for everyone. But I would tell you, countless families, including my own, watched a loved one die behind glass or through a screen because we couldn't get access to them. Children couldn't get to school. People missed their prom or graduation ceremonies. There were lots of things that happened that dramatically changed the future of the country. The mental health issues that we have continued to deal with from the isolation have been profound. Even something as simple as children that wore masks or around adults wearing masks for all that time are slower in learning language now because they couldn't watch someone's lips moving, and so they're slower in that. Amazingly enough, churches and places of worship were forced to be closed down. There were even churches that met where the pastor preached in the parking lot and the congregants all met in their cars with windows up, and police came and scattered them and said, "You can't be here." The simple act of social distancing became an issue. As everyone guessed, what's the right distance to be away from someone else? Literacy rates have declined. All these things are results, not to mention the loss of lives and the health experiences that have been out there for many Americans. So there are legitimate questions. I wanted to be able to raise some of those, to be able to walk through some of this, because it has been very, very challenging. As we've gone through some of your notes and your diary and other things that are out there, we're trying to be able to pull bits and pieces of things to be able to learn lessons. On May the 6th, 2020, you wrote at that time, I had a conversation with Robert Redfield, who, as you know well, was then the director of CDC, about the fact that greater than 1 million children worldwide have missed their measles vaccination because of the shutdown. You stated, this is terrible and needs to be addressed, since on that basis alone, there would be far more excess deaths from measles among children than coronavirus deaths among children. I need to bring this up to the TF, the task force. Did you ever have an opportunity to bring up the potential of measles deaths among children and an infection rate going around the world from measles based on the fact that so many children would not get their measles vaccine because of the shutdown.
I'm sorry, Senator, but on the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
That is your right to do. One of the big issues is really coming up is on the lab issue. This was greatly discussed about whether this came from a lab or whether this came from nature. There are obvious issues and differences between the two to be able to know this. You had a lot of conversation on this. Scientists around the world were in conversation on this. There were different statements that you even made in your private notes and your public notes on it. In January the 26th of 2020, this is before we had our first tragic death of coronavirus in the United States. You wrote, "It now appears using epi data that the genomic data, the first infection was in early December and was not connected to the market," which was the big rumor that was out there, is this wet market in China. We know the market was not the source, it was the amplifier. On January the 31st, you wrote about a phone call. You wrote, "The people on the phone felt the mutations around the furin cleavage site of the spike protein could not have occurred naturally since it would require an evolutionary jump that they found nowhere in bat isolates. They bring up the possibility this could have been deliberately inserted and either accidentally released or deliberately released by a crazy person in the lab, the former being the most likely." February the 1st, same year, 2020. This is again still before our first death. "There was not total agreement about the likelihood of deliberate insertion. Ron said he was sure that this could occur naturally and we should not waste our time and divert our effort to pursue this. This is expected of him since he was the original gain of function person with Yoshi. Also, Christian was with Ron. The rest felt deliberate insertion was possible, and given the fact that Dr. Jingling Shi at the University of Wuhan has been working for years in gain of function in coronaviruses to allow adaptation of the spike protein to bind to the human ACE2 receptor, we could not let this go." That's a remarkable statement for February the 1st of 2020, when there hadn't even been the first death here, but we knew something was moving. You knew well that something was moving. You identified February the 1st, before any of us had ever heard of the Wuhan lab, not only the Wuhan lab in the conversation, but literally the scientist that you named in your own notes, the lead scientist that was there. It's interesting to me on that. And the questions I was going to ask you was just your background and knowledge about the Wuhan lab and Dr. Shi and all the details. I'm aware of where you have been on trying to be able to plead your Fifth Amendment right, which is your right to be able to do. But I also want to be able to find out some facts to be able to help us for the future on this. The Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in May of 2020 put out a classified document that has only been recently unclassified on this, that had this statement: "We assess all the necessary conditions for an accidental release of a laboratory modified coronavirus, specifically a coronavirus adapted to recognize human cell receptors, were present at the Chinese Wuhan Institute of Virology in mid to late 2019. Now, the question that I had for you is, this is May the 27th of 2020. This is the report that most people will see is this. I have clearance. I serve on the Intelligence Committee. I've actually read this complete document unredacted. My concern is, were you given the ability to see this document unredacted based on your position? Were you able to see this and to be able to get this information? I could see it, and I know what's here. Everybody else just has their conclusion at the beginning of it, not this. My question to you was going to be, did you have access? Because it's important for the future that people in your position do have access to this kind of information and insight. Is there any way you could answer that question? Were you able to give access to this data?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
You wrote on January the 26th of 2020, "We should be allowed to send our CDC epidemiologists to China to work with them so they could see the data firsthand." You also wrote in February 12th, 2020, that you had great concerns about the World Health Organization because they depends greatly on China and, as you stated, often bows to them. Now, this is a really important issue that we've got to resolve for the future. It's not just our cooperation with Chinese scientists, it's our acknowledgement that China covered up their data, wouldn't allow our scientists to be able to come in. They cleaned up the wet market, they cleaned up the other areas. They wouldn't allow you to get access to all the other scientists who are there, including their health records, what happened to them, or even all the sequencing that they had done in advance. For the future of our research and our cooperation with any scientist around the world, I think it's really important that we resolve, if we're going to fund research and cooperate with you, we've got to have certain things from you. If things go sideways, we've got to have access to all information in all places. You were noting not only that China was affecting the World Health Organization and that China was bending them to their will. And so the World Health Organization was putting out data that you saw, at least at that point, as being from a Chinese perspective, covering up what was going on. But you also noted we weren't able to get access to all this information. We've got to be able to figure this out for the future to be able to make sure that research that is done, we have access to all information. If something goes sideways at some point, which clearly it did at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and that being, as was noted by many people, the only lab in the world that was doing research like this that had a lower standard of actually their security standards there than many other labs around the world, yet they were doing this very dangerous research. What can we gain? And what advice could you give us to say in a future setting, we've got to make sure that we actually get information from people and we can be guaranteed that we're going to get that insight? Yes, sir.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
I yield back.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to the dark days of the coronavirus pandemic, one of the darkest days or times in our history. Hospitals were overflowing. Navy medical ships were docked in the Hudson River. Emergency rooms were forced into unprecedented triaging during the worst week of the pandemic, which happens to have been the last week of President Trump's first term. More than 25,000 Americans died of COVID-19. Easy to forget those dark days. But for the past 18 months, the Trump administration has been engaged in a campaign to rewrite this history. And today's proceeding, I fear, is part of that effort, one of the darkest days in our Senate's history. The Trump administration has launched a baseless set of smears against vaccines that help pull us out of that public health crisis, vaccines that are undoubtedly President Trump's greatest accomplishment. It has slashed funding to local public health departments that were on the front lines of the pandemic. And those healthcare workers are heroes. It has disparaged those heroes as woke or wasteful. And it has used a politicized Department of Justice to target the researchers who helped us track and understand the novel virus. Today's hearing is another page in that playbook, sadly, tragically. Dr. Fauci, you've spent 5 decades in public service, including nearly 4 decades in leadership at the National Institutes of Health, helping to conquer COVID-19, but also HIV, swine flu, Zika, Ebola, and other epidemics with real life results saving human lives. Put aside all the flowery rhetoric that we hear in the United States Senate. Dr. Fauci has saved lives, as have public health officials in the United States and throughout the world. And today, we are demeaning and degrading their life-saving service. Republicans are eager to rebrand you as a villain in order to distract from their own failure to protect Americans from soaring healthcare costs, They've been rising astronomically in the last couple of years. And from unsafe food, which has caused cyclospora to spread, and resurgent measles as a result of the anti-vaccine policy. This hearing is the culmination of a years-long crusade, which started more than 6 years ago when Dr. Fauci dared to contradict President Trump. The campaign to vilify you, Dr. Fauci, is just one part of this larger campaign against science and facts, a campaign that has made Americans less safe. It is shameful that in a country like ours, dedicated public service like Dr. Fauci has experienced persistent threats to his life since the pandemic because of the lies that are told about him. His attorney has been gagged, thrown out of this hearing room. But he has written a letter to the chairman that is an explanation for the reasons why Dr. Fauci is, in fact, invoking his constitutional right. It is a right. And I would ask that this letter from David Schertler and Danny Onato be made a part of the record if there's no
Without
objection.
objection.
His attorney has also issued a statement within the last half hour, I believe, that sets forth, again, the reasons that he is here to help protect his client's rights. And I would ask that that statement be made part of the record as well, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Let's be very clear. The Fifth Amendment is a right of everyone appearing before an authority like this one. It should be respected. And the reason that Dr. Fauci has invoked it, in the words of his attorney, quote, during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Fauci appeared at least a dozen times for congressional hearings in the Senate alone in answer to questions about the very issues on which you purport to seek information. He has been thoroughly transparent and consistent in providing factual information to Congress, and he is deeply familiar with the processes and protocols of sharing information with the legislative branch. And then referring to the chairman, this years-long public crusade against Dr. Fauci makes one thing clear. This is not a serious effort to seek information from Dr. Fauci in a transcribed interview for a valid legislative purpose. You are single-mindedly fixated on Dr. Fauci, seeing Dr. Fauci prosecuted for imaginary crimes, and you are so invested in that outcome that you have created a personal brand around it. Those are the words of his attorney. And he cites as well the statements of the chairman, which indicate a clear intent that the result of this proceeding be a prosecution. Quote, the power of some of us must be used for good, like putting Fauci in jail. That's from December 23, 2025. I want to give him a subpoena and a jail cell, also from December of 2025. The first was 2024. Those kinds of statements by the chairman of a committee in tweets certainly provide a well-founded fear that the proceeding underway is simply an effort to trap Dr. Fauci in some kind of criminal wrongdoing. That is not the purpose of a congressional hearing, not the valid purpose of a congressional hearing. During some of the dark days in this body, under Senator Joe McCarthy, it became standard operating procedure to seek that kind of prosecutorial objective. We should not be part of a rerun of that kind of effort. This attempt to rebrand one of the most challenging times in our nation's history is a short-sighted act of desperation that will leave us less prepared for the next pandemic. It is an insult to the memory of more than 1 million Americans who died from COVID-19. If there are valid scientific questions about the origins of this pandemic, COVID-19, about the kinds of steps that were taken to counter it, about the need for more preparation, they should certainly be addressed, but not in a show trial, not as part of a continuing vendetta against a single individual. And unfortunately, I fear that is what we are seeing today. America deserves better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In no courtroom in America can you have your witness plead the Fifth Amendment, and then your attorney gets to testify. That's what that letter is. The attorney's complaining and testifying, saying, he didn't do it, the prosecution's unfair. You don't get to do that. That's one thing you give up when you take the Fifth Amendment. You say, I'm not going to testify. I'm not going to give you any information. You don't then get to put your lawyer forward to justify it. He can do it in the press, but you can't come and testify. He was not invited to testify, and he was out of order, and it was appropriate to have him ejected. Senator.
Chairman Paul, thank you for doing this. I think I know in my state, people have been asking questions about Dr. Fauci for years. So Dr. Fauci, your entry has made clear that you love being a hero, a celebrity, and here having the eyes of the world upon you. You loved every newspaper profile, every photo shoot, every fancy dinner with the elites. To many Americans who lost family members, who lost trust in our federal government, you're not a hero. Unfortunately, you're a villain. You made yourself the story and abandoned the American people to serve your own ego. To begin, I would like to talk about your relationship with David Morenz. He was the senior advisor in the NIAID, Office of the Director, your office, for 16 years. He was your friend. He was a frequent guest at your house. You reportedly co-authored over 50 scientific articles with him. You turned to him first right after COVID-19 first occurred. Earlier this year, the Department of Justice charged him with conspiracy against the United States, in addition to other charges as part of a conspiracy to conceal information and falsify records to suppress alternative theories about the origins of COVID-19. Now, you've publicly kicked this man to the curb, saying, Dr. Morenz was not an advisor to me on institute policy or other substantive issues. So let's start with the use of personal Gmail accounts and David Morenz's relationship with Peter Daszak. David Morenz tells Peter Daszak, president of Equal Alliance, and you've got this in front of you, it's Exhibit 1. It's already in the record as part of this. It says, quote, P.S. I forgot to say that there's no worry about FOIA. I can either send stuff to Tony on his private Gmail or hand it to him at work or at his house. He is too smart to let colleagues send him stuff that could cause trouble. Dr. Fauci, did Dr. Morenz's relationship with Peter Daszak concern you? Yes or no?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did David Morenz ever bring documents to your house?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you ever receive a text about your work at NIAID to your personal cell phone?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did any text about your work at NIAID that went to your personal cell phone ever become part of federal records?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you maintain a personal email account while serving as director?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you ever receive work-related communications on that Gmail account from David Morenz?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you preserve any work-related communications on that Gmail account from David Morenz?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did David Moranz ever provide you with documents outside of those two ways that would violate NIH policy for FOIA compliance?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Now let's look at two other communications. You emailed David Moranz on January 26, 2020, quote, "It is important that I speak with you tonight. Please call me at home." This is part of Exhibit 2 that you have in front of you. This email is sent the same day, the exact same day you write in an internal document, quote, "Now we know the market was not the source, it was the amplifier," unquote. Would you call the origins of COVID-19 a substantive issue?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you discuss COVID-19 origins with David Moranz on this phone call?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Now let's take a closer look at the last time you testified before Congress. This is part of what you have in front of you is Exhibit 4, which is part of the record. In June 2024, you testified to Dr. Moranz, quote, "Was not an advisor to me on institute policy or other substantive issues. Furthermore, his office is located in a different building from that of the NIAID director," unquote. Is that still your testimony today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
So today under oath, your testimony remains that Dr. Moranz was not an advisor to you on institute policy or substantive matters.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Now I've got Exhibit 5, which you have in front of you. On October 24, 2021, David Moranz texted you to provide information about and advocate for the controversial EcoHealth Alliance grant. You thank him and tell him that you will check the information. Would you agree that this shows an advisory relationship between David Moranz and yourself?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Do you agree that you two were discussing a substantive issue?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
If documentary evidence establishes that Dr. Moranz advised you regarding EcoHealth Alliance, COVID origins, or grant policy, then your June 2024 testimony would have been inaccurate, correct?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Is there any document in your possession today that would contradict your prior congressional testimony?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Have you deleted, destroyed, or instructed anyone to destroy records after learning Congress is investigating these matters?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Are you aware of anyone who did?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
As you know, Dr. Moranz now faces charges related to destroying records while you distance yourself from him. Is that fair to a decades-long friend?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
When is the last time you spoke to him?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
In hindsight, are you disappointed how you handled COVID? Do you have any regrets?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, I want to close with this. Here's how you impacted my family and people close to me. I have daughters with children. You can't imagine the questions they had around vaccines for their kids and themselves, and the pressure, the unbelievable pressure to make the right decision for their health. I can tell you pregnant women who worked with me were so scared because every time they went to the doctor, they were told something different about taking the vaccine, and you caused this. Imagine being a mom trying to protect their kids, or an expectant mother trying to figure out what to do. Every 3 weeks, a doctor tells you a new set of guidance on a vaccine. The haphazard information you released and pushed on the American people with little research is appalling. and why there's so much distrust in our institutions today. That trust is crucial to public health, and you, more than any person or event in my lifetime, have destroyed that trust for millions of Americans. You lied to hundreds of millions of people amid the worst public health crisis in a century. You failed to follow your own guidance. You forced people to watch their loved ones die alone over the phone. It's disgusting. You destroyed the federal government's credibility when it comes to public health. We have entire generations of Americans who, rightfully so, do not trust our institution to keep people safe because of you. This has destroyed decades of progress and lifetimes of work because you wanted to fuel your own ego and be the center of attention. What would you do differently knowing what you know today, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
All the evidence is right here, and you still can't bring yourself to tell the truth or apologize because you received an auto-pin pardon from a staffer in the Biden White House. If we have another pandemic tomorrow, millions could die because of what you did to make Americans lose trust in their government when it comes to medicine and healthcare. How many families have you apologized to had to watch their loved ones die alone? You breached public trust, and now you're hiding behind a fraudulent pardon. Your legacy will not be as a man who has saved America from COVID, but as a man who destroyed the public trust in America's public health institutions in exchange for 5 minutes of fame. This is how history will remember you. I yield back.
Senator Kim.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci, for coming on out in front of this committee. I know it's not what you would want. It's not what you deserve. I just want to say and start by just saying thank you to you for your service to this nation. I didn't know much about you prior to the pandemic. I came to learn about you from however many Americans did, but I also had the opportunity to talk to you and engage with you as someone who is a member of the Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis over in the House of Representatives. When I learned about your background, 38 years as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, appointed by President Reagan, served under 7 presidents, 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. I admire that greatly. I myself had a chance to serve in the executive branch, serve in government under both a Republican president and a Democratic president. And I believe that we need more of that type of work, a place where we can understand our jobs not as coming from a place of partisanship and politics, but that of just public service. And right now, I feel the hyperpartisanship growing in this country in dangerous ways. I feel it much more present here on the Hill than I did back when I served as a nonpartisan career public servant at the State Department. And I worry about it. I worry about what kind of trajectory we're on as a country and what this causes when it comes next for public service and those willing to step up for our nation. And it's not just in the attacks, but we see it brought out with the cuts to funding, to the firing of federal workers, to the demonization of their motivations, people calling our public servants criminals, thinking that they are there solely to undermine others that are trying to engage. I look at it right now. You know, it's not just that the people are being attacked, our public servants being attacked, but that it's undermining the very nature of the work of governance. You know, these cuts to HHS funding, to NIH funding, to the grants, cuts to the researchers doing the critical work to find cures and medicines. These firing, these cuts, they're creating a chilling effect, honestly, a chilling effect for the next generation of people who might consider stepping up to serve our nation, to be the next generation of researchers who now are wondering whether or not this is the right thing for them to do at a time when they see some of their colleagues or those that they looked up to being attacked, their funding being cut. Researchers that I talk to who are now either leaving the country or considering leaving the country to do their work because of the sheer unpredictability of America. That this nation so great, so powerful has now been crippled with this sense of unpredictability and unreliability. That is not the type of country that I hope we strive to be. I've raised this because these attacks upon Dr. Fauci, it's not just about him. It's sending signals to others who are thinking about serving our country, our scientists, our doctors, our healthcare professionals, our researchers, trying to show to them that if you don't get in line with the politics, that you will also potentially be subject to attacks. And from the work that he has done, from HIV/AIDS to Ebola to COVID, we've seen him try to engage in these crises. They're not easy, especially when it's a novel disease, when you don't know what comes next, a lot of unknowns, having to make decisions without the full breadth of knowledge we always wish we had in hindsight. But there is nothing perfect, no perfect clarity when it comes to pandemics, when it comes to crises. I worked in national security and wars and crises. I made judgment calls, gave my best advice to generals, to ambassadors, even to a president. Did I get it all right? No. Did I do my best? I did everything I thought I could with the information that I had. The public servants, they do this work because they love this country and that they strive to improve it. It's not an easy job, but it is because there is so much at stake in our country. But these public servants do it because they are in the arena. I just want to end by just reading a portion of this because I think it's important as we're thinking about how to be able to treat public servants through this country, to think through this. And in the words of Teddy Roosevelt saying, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strive valiantly, who errs but comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Thank you for your service, Dr. Fauci. I yield back.
Senator Alling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, nothing says honesty like taking the fifth, huh, Doc? Let's try something. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you wearing?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color is the carpet in front of you?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Let's just get one thing straight. You don't have any rights under the Fifth Amendment because you've been pardoned, as you very well know. As the Supreme Court has been clear for a century and more, Brown versus Walker, 1896, when he has been pardoned, he may not stand upon his privilege. You know that. Your lawyers sitting behind you now shifting nervously in their chairs. They know it. This isn't about the Constitution. This isn't about the law. This is about contempt. Contempt for this body and contempt for the American people. But I think I know why you're doing it. It's because you don't want to answer questions. It's because you did all kinds of terrible things. It's because during the pandemic, you got rich, didn't you? You got rich while people were dying, hundreds of thousands of Americans, over 1 million in the end, and you were getting rich. And not only were you doing that, you were using federal employees with taxpayer money to apply for and solicit cash prizes for you personally, cash prizes totaling over $1 million. You did all of that during the pandemic, didn't you? That's a question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
You remember Greg Folkers? Who was that?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Your chief of staff is the answer. Do you remember Patricia Conrad? Who was that?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
She was your personal assistant. And what were these individuals doing in the depth of the pandemic in November of 2020 when millions of Americans were suffering from COVID? What were they doing? I tell you what they're doing. Folkers was on your behalf soliciting and gathering information for a cash award. Let's look at it. We've got his email right here, right over my shoulder. Volker says, I'm working on this nomination for the Dan David Award for Fauci. We need to beef up the COVID part. Do you have language in the can that you could share that delineates how we responded in new ways to COVID? He sends this to multiple federal employees. What was the Dan David Award? Do you remember, Doc?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
It was a $900,000 cash award. $900,000 cash award. And he got it because he used federal employees to get it. And this wasn't the only award, was it, Dr. Fauci? In fact, you applied for and received at least 8 other federal cash prizes on federal time using federal employees and federal resources. Here they are over my shoulder. Besides the Dan David Award, you've got the Partnership for Public Service, you've got the Adelson Prize, you've got the Smithsonian Award, you've got the National Academy of Medicine's Award, you've got the CDC Foundation. In fact, you turned your staff into a full-time application machine. You actually wrote to people and said, do you think maybe I'd qualify? And you got cash for all of this. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 employees, was it? In fact, you used 8 separate federal employees on federal time using federal resources to solicit cash awards. Isn't that true?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Here they are right over my shoulder. Here's all of them. The people that you use, federal employees, so that you could go and get cash money. And the most hilarious part is that you weren't content to even dragoon them into applying for all of these cash awards. You then had them go out to the ethics agencies and ethics watchdogs and demand that you be able to get the money. That's right. We've got it in your emails. Your staff and employees on federal time using federal resources being paid with federal dollars are soliciting cash for you. And then they're turning around and saying to the agency, we don't want just an answer. We want to get to yes, because Fauci wants the money. He wants it. We want to get to yes, and yes takes time. This is your chief of staff again, using federal email to pressure the agency's own ethics people so that you could get money. So that you could get rich. And it violated the law, didn't it, Dr. Fauci? Didn't it? It violated the law, didn't it? It is a question. You can answer. Go ahead.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Federal law, as you very well know, prohibits the solicitation of cash awards or other personal benefits for federal employees. And it certainly prohibits using your own employees to do this. 5 CFR section 2635-205B. It says it right there in black and white. You cannot use federal resources, federal dollars, federal employees, federal offices, federal email, federal time to solicit cash awards. And you did all of it. And the worst part is thousands of people were dying while you were doing it. You were supposed to be the nation's doctor and you're playing one on TV, but this is what you were doing with your time. Isn't that true?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, I could see why. I can certainly see why. You know what I can't quite figure out is that why you were so obsessed with it, because you're already rich. I mean, and your scheme worked here. I mean, your net worth now is north of $12 million. You got over $1 million in cash awards during COVID, during a 12-month, 24-month span during COVID. $1 million you knocked down in cash money using federal resources. Now you're worth more than $12 million. You've got a pension that in its first year paid out north of $400,000 a year. 1 million people dead, you're getting rich. 1 million people dead, you're using federal employees to get cash awards for you. 1 million people dead, and you're here taking the fifth because you don't want to admit that what really happened in all that time was a multi-month, multi-year course of self-dealing. Isn't that true, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Yeah, well, silence is admission. And here's the real thing. At the end of the day, it wasn't just about the money, really, was it? It was really about a power trip. I mean, through all of this, you want to be the most famous scientist in the world. You were so focused on getting every award and every drop of cash that you could, all because you wanted to be on TV. You wanted to be the sun god of science. You wanted to be the guy who was in charge of it all. You wanted to lambaste Trump. You wanted to make sure that nobody else stole your spotlight. You wanted to be the guy. You had time to sit for InStyle magazine. Here's what you were doing with your time. You could sit for InStyle magazine, but you can't answer questions for the American people. You could sit for InStyle magazine, but you're here taking the fifth. You could sit for InStyle magazine and get $1 million in cash awards, but now the cat's got your tongue. I bet he does. I tell you what, here's my conclusion from all of this. This was really all about you the whole time. Somewhere along the way, you lost your way. You may have been a good public servant at one time. I don't know. But what I can tell you from reading your emails now, from looking at what you did, how you used your employees, somewhere along the line, it became all about you. You became a narcissist and a megalomaniac and a liar. And you've lied to the American people, and you've lied to this body. And you've disgraced your profession by doing it. You called yourself the most famous scientist in the world. You've done more to harm science than anybody in my lifetime. And I hope you'll go home and write that in your diary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Fetterman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, I'm not here to perhaps attack you or defend or anything. It's really just more, honestly, I just want to acknowledge I have had members of my family die from COVID, and now I also grieve for people that I've met that have lost their business through the pandemic, and they'll never been the same. Now, as during the pandemic, I was the lieutenant governor, so we were in the middle of all of that maelstrom, trying to find the right balance between protect life and protect the economics and for all of it. And I'm not sure if we got it all right or wrong, but without a doubt, I can continue to question myself. But one that it's not about much more your regrets, but I have one. And that is early on that there was the theory that the virus could have emerged from the lab. And early on that became like a right-wing kinds of theory. And I thought it seemed to make sense. Now there was a really advanced lab that was close by, and then you have this unknown virus out. So, but that became a very partisan thing. And now it seems now it's more and more emerging theory that would have come from the lab. Now, I think that the next time our nation's facing something like this, we are not become, as I might have been, blinded by the partisan idea that maybe the truth might come from a side that's different than you are. But I think we should really be willing to pursue truth, no matter where that may have emerged, after for all of that. So, and I now cede the remain back to the chair. Thank you.
Senator Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I will echo Senator Johnson's comments about your opening statement, Mr. Chairman. I think it was dead on. Very, very well done. Mr. Fauci, do you know who David Schertler is?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. What does the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution say?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. Advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
I'm going to give the Constitution to my aide. He'll bring it over to you so you can have it for future reference. I think it's something that every American should know what the Constitution says. Do you know who wrote the Fifth Amendment?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution.
So you're invoking a right that you don't know who wrote it or what it says. Is that correct?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Wow. All right, let me tell you who David Schertler is for the audience, because he was ejected by the chairman. He's a high-profile criminal attorney. He's represented some really great people, like Senator Bob Menendez. Maybe that's somebody who my Democrat colleagues may remember took gold bars as bribes from the Egyptians. And there's an article here in the Washington Free Beacon that talks about why you would hire a guy like David Schertler. And the comment is, if you're in deep shit, that's who you call. Do you feel like you're in deep shit?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Clearly, what you think today is that somehow you're above reproach. Somehow you feel like you don't need to be treated like a normal American. Can you do me a favor in the audience and stand up if during the time of the COVID pandemic, you were called a racist for calling the virus a Wuhan virus or the China virus? If you thought the 6-foot rule was total crap, if you thought the vaccine wasn't something that you should take, if you thought it was outrageous the way the mask policy was rolled out, if you were fired from your job for not taking that vaccine, including members of the military, if you thought closing schools was catastrophically stupid, and that you thought that during these times saying these things made you somehow a lesser human being. Dr. Fauci, can you just turn around and look at the people behind you? You're not willing to do that? That's not a question. It's not a question. To your lawyers, not a question. It's a request. All you have to do is look up from your lawyers and look at the people who were absolutely shamed for saying what we know now to be the truth. You can't even look at them? That's a question. Are you able to look at them? You can sit down in the audience. There was a mom in Ohio during the depth of the coronavirus pandemic, decided to go to her high school football game for her son. They hadn't been out much. The kids had been learning at school, and then the school got shut down. They hadn't really gotten much out of that education, as any parent knew. That remote learning was no learning at all. But it was a Friday night. Her son wanted to go watch a buddy go play football. So they went to the stadium. They sat alone, far from everybody else, just a mom, a dad, a few kids. They didn't feel they needed to wear masks because it was stupid, because they were outside. They all live together. They're not near anybody. Dr. Fauci, do you know what happened to that mom and that family? That's a question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
They were dragged out of that stadium and arrested. Those policies were put in place because you had moronic politicians that listened to the words of a megalomaniac who was more interested in having met a Kardashian than the suffering of the American people. And that is you. Your advice to communities like that, to idiotic politicians who enforce those rules, arrested that mom for watching a football game with her own family outside. When that story broke, I said to myself, I cannot stand idly on the side and watch this happen. It was about 6 years ago today that I decided I'm going to give up my businesses, sell them all, run for office, run for the United States Senate. Here I am sitting in front of you 6 years later saying, who the fuck do you think you were for doing that? It is a total disgrace what you did to this country. And if my Democrat colleagues are standing there defending you, I hope the voters of the United States of America watch the clips of every one of you doting on a guy who was more interested in being a celebrity than saving American people. I will make it my mission to make certain that every single one of those Democrats who did that will see that clip over and over and over again. Because there is no defense of what you did. You may have had a 50-plus year legacy of public service, but it ends in total and complete disgrace. So let me ask you an opportunity to answer one question. Will you apologize, just apologize, to the people who you harmed through your actions? Will you say, do you have the dignity to just say you're sorry?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
So you won't apologize to the military members who Joe Biden summarily dismissed from the military for not taking the vaccine?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Will you apologize to the business owners that lost their business, shattered their lives, and they'll never recover?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Will you apologize to the moms who had to force their infant children, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, to put masks on, and what that did and how that traumatized those kids?
Under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Will you apologize to the family members of the people who died because they took your advice and not only got the first vaccine, but the 5, 6 other boosters that they did not need?
To answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Will you apologize to that mom from Ohio for being arrested for watching a football game with her family?
Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
So you didn't know who wrote the Fifth Amendment. It's James Madison. Lived in this town. I can only wonder what he would think of somebody like you invoking his writings to shield culpability for the actions that you took. It's no secret why you have to hire the biggest dirtbag attorney on the planet, because of what you did. I hope you're paying him well. And I hope that one way or the other, somewhere, sometime, you answer for your crimes.
There are 4 more senators to go
Senator
during
Ernst.
this hearing. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats.
Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. Dr. Fauci, Americans haven't forgotten the tragic stories of people who lost loved ones during COVID and those that were denied a chance to say goodbye to their family members that were in hospitals or residing in nursing homes because of the COVID-19 protocols. Americans haven't forgotten the mandates, the adverse reactions to vaccines, the government misinformation, social media censorship, hotlines to tattle on their neighbors, the forced school closures, the tragic rise in suicides, or those businesses that were forced to close during lockdowns. Americans haven't forgotten the hundreds of billions of dollars spent by taxpayers for COVID relief, stolen by fraudsters who bought Rolls Royces and yachts. These were taxpayer dollars. Americans have lost trust in science and government after the COVID response. Trust which will be incredibly difficult for us to gain back. Dr. Fauci, you said that the science was evolving and that your recommendations evolved with it. But Americans remember you as the public face of the coronavirus response. As one of the nation's most trusted voices, you urged policies you said were absolutely necessary, even when those policies came at an enormous human and economic cost. And Americans deserve answers about reports that you may have worked with others to pressure the president into adopting the slow the spread strategy, and why you later sought an unconditional pardon for crimes you may have committed dating back to 2014. Dr. Fauci, in 2022, you had a taxpayer-funded salary of $480,000 a year. You were, in fact, the highest paid federal employee in the entire federal government, even making more and the President of the United States. According to now public documents, that was due in large part to your work on biodefense. Unreported is how NIAID spent over $1 billion from 2009 to 2026 in biodefense and influenza federal contracts and subcontracts. My office uncovered records on usaspending.gov that show from 2015 to 2020, NIAID paid out $515,418 in subcontracts to Harbin Veterinary Institute in Harbin, China, including $100,000 a few days after it opened a BSL-4 biolab in 2018. That very same institute was criticized for doing gain-of-function bird flu research in 2013. And yet you were funding them for years after that, sending U.S. taxpayer dollars to China. These contracts, which we also trace to NIAID, show U.S. taxpayers funded gain-of-function researchers in the Netherlands and in Wisconsin, funding the same folks whose controversial work led President Obama to pause this exact type of dangerous pandemic research. Dr. Fauci, did you know that the NIH's billion-dollar Sears contract programs were funding gain-of-function researchers in China, the U.S., and in the Netherlands?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, Dr. Deborah Birx wrote in her book that you and President Obama's former CDC director were at a Saturday, March 14th, 2020 meeting at her home 2 days before the president announced his 15 days to slow the spread effort. Your now released diaries said the meeting was a week before that. Dr. Birx said you all were trying to trap the president into having no other options. She wrote, your plan was to, quote, block any of the president's escape routes. So, quote, he'd have no choice but to agree to our flatten the curve measures. Yes or no, Dr. Fauci? Did you try to block or trap President Trump into the slow the spread, flatten the curve measures in March 2020?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
When the COVID-19 virus broke out in Wuhan, China, you, Dr. Fauci, knew pretty much right away that NIH had funded Chinese labs, including those doing coronavirus research. There's email traffic from early January 2020 where your staff was flagging for you that NIH funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth Alliance. Yet few Americans knew we funded the Wuhan lab because the funding went through a sub-award and was not reported to the public database like usaspending.gov as it should have been. Also, EcoHealth violated federal law by failing to report in its research papers how much taxpayer funding it spent on that research. At my request, the Government Accountability Office helped track down that $1.4 million of U.S. taxpayer money that was sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, both by you, Dr. Fauci, and through USAID. But first, it passed through EcoHealth Alliance, which I helped to get defunded through the NDAA. Dr. Fauci, did you intentionally use subaward funding to obscure NIH funding of Chinese biolabs and coronavirus research?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
NIAID awarded multi-million-dollar grants to a number of scientists shortly after they wrote publicly in the Proximal Origins paper that the COVID virus likely came from nature. Though documents Chairman Paul released last week show in private, those same scientists were much more open to the virus being from a lab. In 2023, Representative Jordan insinuated that you basically gave a $9 million bribe in the form of an NIH grant to NIH-funded virologists to say the virus likely was from nature. Dr. Fauci, yes or no, did you reward the Proximal Origin authors by giving them NIAID grants or contracts?
I decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Dr. Fauci, we have learned that U.S. coronavirus researchers at UNC shipped, quote, humanized or transgenic mice to China by around 2017 for use in their dangerous coronavirus work. Under your NIAID coronavirus, researchers also used aborted baby body parts in mice research, and taxpayers paid for them to do that. NIH-funded coronavirus researcher Dr. Ralph Barrick and his colleagues at UNC put parts of livers, thymuses, and chunks of human fetal lung that they got from aborted, almost 5-month-old human babies. They put those parts in their research mice. They disgustingly named them BLTL mice and wrote they had created a, quote, sandwich of aborted body parts in the mice. Get it, folks? BLT. A BLT sandwich. Your RML lab employees in Montana also ordered and used aborted baby body parts in their taxpayer-funded research. And emails show how they plan to use those mice for post-COVID work. NIH funded putting aborted babies' fingers and scalps off the heads of aborted babies and putting them into the backs of research mice. The scalps later grew fine baby hair in the mice. They even included those disgusting photos in their research paper that you funded. Not all of those were research on coronaviruses, but some were. Thankfully, the current NIH director has said no more of this. Dr. Fauci, yes or no, do you think that human aborted parts should be put into mice for coronavirus research?
The advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Mr. Chairman, would you direct the witness to answer the questions that we have been asking?
He probably would if he was here, but I can direct it. But no, I think we understand his answer.
We do understand that. Americans are asking for accountability, Dr. Fauci, and your silence is very telling. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Moody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm the most junior member of the Senate here, showing from where I sit. I just got here last year. Many of you may remember I was the Attorney General in Florida who fought back against the lockdowns, the school closures, the church closures, everything to embrace sanity and science. We fought back. We got ridiculed for it. And we didn't just call people names. We actually impaneled a grand jury of people of all walks of life, all political persuasions. So that's how I came here, fighting for a free state amongst states that had locked their own people down. We are now called the Free State of Florida. And I believe our responsibility here is to make sure that government remembers the people are our bosses, that we report to them, that we're accountable to them. Government shouldn't operate for itself. Government operates on behalf of and for the American people. And anytime we get close to reporting back to our bosses about what government has done or how it's been abused, or how individuals that are employed by the government had acted in their own self-interest or against the interests of the American people, every time we get close, if we start uncovering outrageous fraud, we'll have a hearing. And the tactics have been to not show up. So you'll have all of us over here trying to drill down on why we've been giving money that actually works against American citizens, and no one shows up. Today nobody's here at the moment. Today there seems to be a different tactic. Today we have Democrats showing up and trying to spin why we shouldn't even be having this hearing to report back to our bosses. As one said, today's hearing does damage. It will deter others from public service. Another said, this hearing is designed to entrap you. Another said, one fell all over himself, flattering you, thanking you for your service multiple times, quoting man in the arena. Another said that we are demeaning first responders. And today is a sad play in a repeated playbook, or we're going after one man. I mean, all of their time was used on why we should not be having the hearing to report back to our bosses and give the people accountability. So I would like to talk about that because I believe that the trust the American people place in our public health institutions and what happened to that trust during COVID is important. Because in a public health emergency, they are asked to make extraordinary sacrifices based on advice given to them by the government that is supposed to be working for them. And for that system to work, the public has to be able to trust the people giving them instructions. That trust depends on candor. Would you agree with that, Dr. Fauci?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
And when the evidence is uncertain, officials need to say so. When recommendations are based on assumptions rather than hard data, they need to say so. And when they get something wrong, they need to own it. And when the trust is lost and the consequences extend far beyond any single pandemic, the next time public health officials genuinely need Americans to listen, millions of people may simply ignore them or not believe them. And Dr. Fauci, you were undeniably the face of the federal government's COVID response. You said so yourself in your diary. You said it's not hyperbole to say, I've become the most famous and talked about person in the country. So I want to understand how we got here. Let's start at the beginning.
All right, everybody, I'm going to hop in here for a little bit. We've been watching for a little over 2 hours, about 2 hours and 20 minutes here. This has been the testimony of Dr. Anthony Fauci in front of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. I am Meagan Medick from NewsNation's Unreported. Thank you so much for watching the live stream with us. We will continue to have the live stream on the screen, and our producers are watching with us. So if anything happens, we will turn the volume back up for you and flag you to that moment immediately. But we want to get to some of the recap and some of the analysis of what's actually going on here and what we have heard today. We know that Dr. Fauci has pled the fifth. He has pled the fifth for everything that has been asked of him today from this committee. This committee has 15 senators on it, 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. We have an absolute all-star panel with us right now who can give us some expert opinions and advice and tell us exactly what's going on, breaking down what's in the room. I'm going to give you guys a quick recap of who our panel is. We have Robert Driscoll. He is a legal analyst, former senior DOJ official, extensive experience with congressional investigations, subpoenas, and witness representation. You know what it's like to be in that room right now with Fauci. We have Dr. Amesh Adalja. He is a medical and biosecurity expert, an infectious disease physician, senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. You may recognize him. He was one of the faces of the pandemic, helping Americans navigate us through when the pandemic was first happening in those early days. And then we have trial attorney. We have Reagan Charleston Thomas here, who's going to help us figure out what can actually happen in court going forward. So if you've been watching with us, just a quick recap. This has just been a complete politicization of science. We would think that a hearing over COVID would be bipartisan because it affected everyone. But of course, this is Washington, D.C., so the Democrats and the Republicans took an opportunity to go after each other and the situation. Democrats are attacking the Trump administration and the state of health in the United States today, while Republicans are strongly focusing on Fauci's alleged role in gain-of-function research, vaccine distribution, and public deception. As I said at the top, Fauci has been pleading the fifth, on everything that he has been asked. We have a quick moment from this hearing that we could not see due to the one camera angle of this courtroom. We do have it for you that we will be able to pull. This is Fauci's lawyer being thrown out of the room by Senator Rand Paul. His name was David Schertler. We're just going to roll that clip for you just for 1 second so everyone can kind of see what was going on there.
Security, please remove him from the room.
Can we add that to the stage? Oh, yep, I see it at the bottom there. We're working on it for you guys. When we're ready, our team will flag us and we will play it for you. Dr. Amesh, I know that you have a time crunch here and you have to hop soon, so I'm going to start with you, and then we will get with Mr. Bob Driscoll and Reagan Thomas. Amesh, do you agree that this hearing today is taking focus away from medical care in the United States, which is in the main argument that Democrats are making?
I do think that when you think about our resiliency to infectious disease threats, this hearing didn't get us anywhere further into trying to improve that in the United States. We have measles outbreaks, cyclospora outbreaks, and Ebola outbreak raging in the DRC. We have massive concerns about how the U.S. is going to be prepared, chiefly because we have RFK Jr. as the HHS secretary, someone who doesn't even believe in the germ theory of disease. And I think that what you saw here was a lot of grandstanding and tribal politics and nothing probative. It was all very performative, and this could have been done in an appropriate manner that didn't prompt Dr. Fauci to take the Fifth Amendment, and you could have actually had a good discussion here. But I don't think that this was something that this was designed to do. And I think that they had preconceived notions, and they all wanted to get their talking points in on the Republican side, and that basically made this a worthless type of hearing. It's just playing to their bases.
The vaccine was brought up and vaccine injuries. There was a graphic shown, a big poster board with some data on vaccines. We heard a lot during the pandemic, follow the science, trust the science. When the vaccine came out, do you feel like there was enough data, tests, studies done that it was actually safe and effective for Americans to take when it first came out?
I do. And that prop that Senator Johnson used was just disinformation. He was misusing the vaccine database and As you can see up there, they put ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and then put the vaccines there to make a political point. There was no, that wasn't actually a valid way to look at vaccine injuries. And the fact is, when there were signals that came out, like myocarditis or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that was handled very appropriately and quickly with the systems that were in place. So I think that was all very, very disingenuous. They have a narrative here that they think these vaccines, that the risk outweighs the benefit, and they exaggerate the risks, and they use information very wildly without any kind of context to try and scare people away from the vaccines. And I think that that's what you saw there. And I do think these vaccines, which have been given to billions and billions of people, are safe, and they were effective at doing what they were designed to do, which was prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death from COVID. There's no question about that in the minds of actual scientists and infectious disease physicians that relied on those vaccines. This is a political issue that's been transformed into tribal politics, and now there's no kind of semblance of even respect for reality or how you actually think about vaccine safety anymore.
So do you think that the American public's view on vaccines has changed due to the pandemic, and mostly people are thinking they're unsafe in general?
I do think that the general public has become more anti-vaccine, and you see that with the installation of RFK Jr., who is a chief anti-vaccine advocate as the HHS secretary. But the majority of people, Republicans and Democrats alike, do support vaccines. You hear a lot from people that are very vocal about this, and there are more of them than there had been, and they definitely seized government power in the form of RFK Jr. But I do think most people want their children to be vaccinated. They see the value of vaccines and helping them live in a world in which there are infectious disease threats. But the anti-vaccine movement they took the opportunity of COVID and the fact that people had bundled things that they were rightly disappointed about, like school closures, with the vaccine, and now that's all bundled together in their minds, and they kind of paint with a very broad brush, and they've become anti-vaccine to higher degrees. And that's not just the COVID vaccine. We see that with measles outbreaks at record numbers in the United States. We see it in tetanus and diphtheria and pertussis vaccination rates falling. So it is something that basically got catapulted by the pandemic, but it's still not the majority of people. But there's still too many people who are not getting vaccinated or not getting their children vaccinated.
Okay, I have one more question for you because I know that you need to go. When the pandemic was happening, first days, you were on television a lot. I personally booked you a ton of times to come on our NewsNation shows at the very beginning in 2020. Did you ever feel pressure from the medical community or certain aspects from, was it a television producer? Was it the government? Was the medical area? Did you ever feel pressure to stick to a certain narrative when it came to the pandemic?
No, I did not. And if you look at my writings at that time, I was not necessarily in either of the camps there. I wasn't somebody that was advocating for school closures. I actually advocated against it. I was somebody who talked about more targeted measures rather than broad lockdowns. So I don't think that I had that kind of a feeling. And I actually was very open about where I disagreed or agreed with the government's policy, including on boosters. And if you look through things that I wrote, op-eds that I published in the Washington Post, they were not orthodox. So no, I did not feel any of that pressure. I know that people didn't like what I was writing sometimes when I was talking about using targeted approaches and opening things up and opening schools, but there was never any pressure or blowback that I received. And I have always spoke what actually my analysis was, not clouded by anybody telling me what I should or shouldn't say.
Well, thank you so much for your honesty and being on our panel today. Please, you're welcome to stick around for as long as you can. I know I'll have absolutely more questions for you, but I just wanted to honor your time and respect your time. Bob Driscoll, let's head on over to Rand Paul, Senator Rand Paul. He said it is against the law to refuse to testify. Is this true or false?
I think broadly speaking, it's true. The Fifth Amendment is designed to protect you from legal jeopardy from testifying against yourself. And once that jeopardy is removed, you no longer have the right to plead the Fifth. I think the most obvious historical example people would have or be aware of is Oliver North, back in the days of Iran-Contra, originally pled the Fifth before the investigative committee into Iran-Contra. Then the committee granted him immunity. And then once he was granted immunity from prosecution, they compelled his testimony. And so the famous testimony we have of Oliver North when he was mixing up with senators and his famous lawyer, Brendan Sullivan, that all came after a witness had pled the fifth. He was granted immunity, and then he was compelled to testify and could no longer plead the fifth. And so the question is whether or not the pardon serves the same function in terms of granting the witness immunity. What's particularly fascinating about it is this is one of these situations where the shoe is going to be on the other foot in about a year or 2 years when, either after the midterms or after the next election, there's going to be a lot of Trump administration officials who are holding pardons that the president may have granted that Democratic members of Congress may want to call before a committee to testify about things that went on during the Trump administration. And so there's an interesting precedent about whether or not, even if you don't have a risk of prosecution for your actions, the perceived fear that they're trying to set a so-called perjury trap for you, or that they're having a hearing in bad faith, is sufficient to not testify before Congress. And I think there's a real chance, I think that Congress will protect its prerogatives, and I suspect at least the committee will vote to hold Dr. Fauci in contempt. They will seek a referral to the Department of Justice, either by vote of the entire Senate or simply a letter from Chairman Paul. And there will be a court will probably have to resolve at some point whether or not Dr. Fauci's invocation of the Fifth Amendment was proper. And if it was not, then he could be either charged with contempt of Congress for not testifying substantively, or he could be charged with conceivably obstruction of justice. If you think the analogy, again, I think people would remember from the last go around with Trump, was both Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro were both charged with contempt of Congress for not testifying before Congress. They both asserted that they had a constitutional right not to do so based on executive privilege. But then the courts reviewed that in the course of the prosecutions. They reviewed that assertion and decided that that invocation of a constitutional right was not valid under the circumstances. And so I suspect there could be similar litigation that will go on here should the Senate or should Senator Paul decide to pursue it. So I think broadly speaking, Senator Paul is right that the invocation of the fifth is not generally proper when you're not at risk of jeopardy. Because if you think about it from a separation of powers perspective or from a congressional authority perspective, if simply prospectively you're worried that the committee is going to charge you with a false statement in bad faith, then anybody could plead the fifth and not give substantive testimony at any time, whether or not they've been granted immunity, whether or not they've been granted a pardon, whether or not they had a risk of prosecution. So I think it is going to be something that I'll be following it closely to see what the follow-up is. It seemed to me like Dr. Paul or Senator Paul was surprised by the invocation because it took him a little while to kind of get his bearings and make the legal case. And several Republican senators talked about how it was Dr. Fauci's right to invoke the fifth, which I'm not positive upon reflection, Chairman Paul would wish they said. So anyway, it's a fascinating day to me. Unfortunately, I agree with the doctor. It has nothing to do with the substance, nothing advanced what we know about pandemics and how to plan at all. It's a process issue, but it's an important process issue that I think will play out over the next 6 months to a year. It's also setting precedent for the next round of Trump subpoenas that will be happening in either 7 months or 2 years and 7 months.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think we were all very surprised that he was pleading the fifth. I think we were expecting a showdown between Fauci and Rand Paul per usual, per their other meetings in Congress. But Reagan, Senator Johnson and Senator Hawley both alluded to saying that they understood why Fauci was pleading the fifth, and they were alleging that it's because he's guilty. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, we're wading into things that are not yet implicated. And I think that Professor Driscoll just touched upon this. I think it was Hawley brought up Brown v. Walker. And that is a seminal SCOTUS case. And the Fifth Amendment applies when there's a real risk of incrimination left. If a valid pardon removes the risk for the covered past conduct, Brown, supports the idea that the witness cannot keep using the fifth, right, to avoid talking about the pardoned conduct. But there's a scope issue here, and we have to determine what conduct did that pardon cover, how narrow was it, and that's going to be discussed, and then ultimately can the privilege apply? And I think that that's something that's going to be interesting to see, which camp wins. And here Fauci's pleading the fifth because he's essentially protecting himself, like Professor Driscoll said so eloquently, from what has been called a perjury trap. And so there are a lot of different nuanced things at play here. But Hawley woke up the room. The demonstratives were powerful, and there are some fascinating legal issues, and it certainly will play out over the course of the next 6 months. We're going to see how Senator Paul is going to react to this. There's a few different routes. They could grant immunity and then compel testimony. But I don't see that as a likely outcome. I think a contempt finding from Congress is going to be the likeliest outcome here. And then, ultimately the DOJ, will take that up. So we're going to see, what's going to happen with Dr. Fauci. But I think a lot of people were surprised that he invoked his Fifth Amendment right today. And perhaps that's because everyone, was kind of comfortable in this, the pardon territory, and that he would openly speak about past conduct, and weren't largely overwhelmed by the threat of, this perjury trap, so to speak. But the fireworks did not come from any testimony from Dr. Fauci. I think it was a heavily politicized day. There were some old school trial theatrics that went on, and as a trial attorney, it did wake me up. And I like I said, I loved Hawley's demonstratives, and also loved seeing Fetterman in a suit. But we're going to watch.
I noticed that as well.
Yeah, I mean,
where's the sweatshirt?
It's awesome. I really liked it. That was one thing. And then Senator Moreno, dropping the F-bomb. That was pretty incredible. The deep shit question. I was just taking notes, and it just felt like an old school, trial moment. But Dr. Fauci just sat very uncomfortably and, just kept repeating. He was pleading the fifth throughout the entire hearing. And what ultimately comes of that will be a fight in court. Is he granted the privilege to do so in this set of circumstances, and what's the scope of that pardon? And we'll see. It is fascinating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Completely fascinating. I know that Senator Paul is kind of giving some closing remarks here. Let's turn the volume up a little bit so we can hear what he is saying. If he's going to mention next steps or anything like that.
Research was, the risks of it were worth the benefits. But I've reassessed since 15 million people died. People say, well, gosh, these things never happen. We know it happened in 1977. We know with 100% certainty a virus escaped. In 1977, there's something called the Russian flu. Nobody's exactly positive how it got out. But when they sequenced it, they found out that a flu in 1977 had exactly the same RNA as a 1954 one that they had in the lab and they had created a vaccine for. In fact, turns out anybody born before 1954 was immune, and the only people who got it were people who were born between
he's going into more of the details.
But it was identical.
History of
the genetic sequence was identical to this vaccine
research information that he has done research on.
And that doesn't happen because these respiratory viruses are always.
Let's go to you, Mr. Driscoll. Rand Paul, he posted this on his X account yesterday, and it's interesting because it talks about the pardon from Joe Biden, and now that he's pled the fifth. He said, if Anthony Fauci comes before my committee tomorrow and perjures himself, his preemptive pardon from Joe Biden will not protect him. Is that true? And does anything with the auto pen signing the pardon play into that?
Yeah, that's certainly true, is that the pardon only covers past conduct up until the date of the pardon. If you commit a new crime after the date you're pardoned, you're out of luck, and you can still get prosecuted for that. So anyone can always get prosecuted for a false statement before Congress if they make a false statement before Congress. But the problem is the logic ends up being circular, because if that's a sufficient basis to plead the fifth, that you're worried that testifying truthfully is going to get you a false statement charge, then every single witness before Congress could plead the fifth without consequence. And so there really is a, I mean, I think that the obvious answer is to, testify truthfully is the most obvious way. Now, lawyers have tried this in the past. I mean, one of the scandals like 20 years ago, I remember Monica Goodling, who was a Justice Department employee involved with the U.S. Attorney firing scandal. I've represented a related client before Congress. She pled the fifth, and there was no risk of criminal prosecution because they were talking about civil hiring standards related to whether or not it had been politicized. She still took the fifth on the advice of her attorney, and the same question was raised then as to whether or not that was an appropriate invocation of the fifth. Some of this ends up being pragmatic of it's going to take time for them to figure out what they're going to do. And so Fauci doesn't have to kind of face the music today with the questions. But I think the more important part for him, and I hope his attorneys advised him of this, is whenever you're advising someone about the possibility of taking the fifth, particularly in a public hearing, you have to warn them that exactly what happened today is going to happen. That because you cannot selectively invoke the fifth question by question, you are leaving yourself open to, the questioners can infer the worst things about you, and you have no ability to respond. They can lay out misleading evidence and just ask you, do you agree? And you can't respond. You have to be ready to take that politically. And I think that, it was, I won't say I felt bad for Dr. Fauci. He put himself in the position, but I'm sure it was difficult for him to sit there and listen to some of the things said. I mean, they did everything but say, Dr. Fauci, is there a dead body in your trunk of your car when we go home? And he would have to give the same answer.
Yeah.
And so they just, that is a beating that you have to take. And the question is it worth it? Or did you think you really spared him any risk of a referral? Because now he's probably going to get a referral anyway for obstruction for not answering the questions into the fifth. Because it happened very briefly, but Chairman Paul said that the chair had ruled on the assertion of the privilege. The chair had ruled it was an invalid privilege. And that's technically what needs to happen. So it was important they put those words on the record. And now, usually, traditionally, if I were explaining this to a class 2 years ago, I would have said that there would be a vote on contempt in this committee. There might need to be a Senate-wide vote on. I haven't looked at the Senate rules recently. In the House, you would need a House-wide vote. In the Senate, I think you still do as well. That's the way it would go. However, more recently, things have become so partisan in Washington. I know in the House, Chairman Jordan has made referrals directly to DOJ for obstruction for an invalid assertion of privilege. There was a witness in the Hunter Biden investigation before Jordan, whose attorney got very aggressive, asserting kind of separation of powers and privilege objections. Chairman Jordan declared on the record that he thought the lawyer's objections were too broad. The chair didn't recognize the privileges as valid and made a referral to DOJ for prosecution. So I think there could be a direct referral for prosecution short of a contempt vote. So he may not even need the votes to make that referral. And with this Justice Department, I think that there'll be a decent chance of that getting a strong look. So it's going to be very interesting to see, what happens. In a self-centered way, I'm happy because I have material for this fall seminar in congressional investigations that I teach.
Congratulations.
I had kind of a blank spot in week 12 doing my syllabus as we head to the fall, and
That's got to feel good. Yeah.
drop in there. So, but I found it from a clinical perspective fascinating, and it's a human day for everyone involved. Though. I mean, I'm sure it's a tough day for Dr. Fauci and his family to watch him go through that. And I think a lot of people who are angry about the COVID response probably got a little bit of relief by seeing advocates of theirs kind of pound on Fauci a little bit. But it's unfortunately the main point is the science, and I'm not a scientist, but the substance was just not advanced at all. And that's kind of the unfortunate part, is when at some point, even in a partisan environment, can Congress get down to actually answering some of the questions that need to be answered for kind of broad public health purposes. Not that these aren't worth answering. If Fauci did anything wrong, that's fine, perfectly appropriate. But there's broader questions at stake, and it feels like we didn't get to any of those today, which is unfortunately, probably a sign the system's a little bit broken.
Yeah. So Dr. Amish, what would that look like? Senator Blumenthal said this is not the basis of a valid congressional hearing. So what would be a valid congressional hearing in your eyes from a medical perspective for us to get to the bottom of what happened during the pandemic?
To me, the question would be sort of about, if you go back to origins, what are the pieces of evidence they need to conclusively say this is coming from the wet market, this is coming from a lab? What type of information is missing from the records from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in terms of what types of experiments they were doing, what were the appropriate biosafety levels, what types of coronaviruses do they have in their inventory? All of that would really be important if you're trying to understand what are the origins of this virus and how do we prevent the next coronavirus pandemic or the next pandemic it might be. The other part of this would be preparation and how do you prepare for infectious disease emergencies. And one thing that's happening here is they're scapegoating Dr. Fauci, who didn't actually have the power to do any of that. When you think about how an expert interacts with policymakers, it's to give them advice, it's to give them options, it's to tell them what different scenarios would be. And then it's the policymaker, which are presidents, governors, mayors, school board members, that have to actually interpret that data, weigh all the competing interests, think about short-term versus long-term, and then make decisions. But what we saw in COVID, and this was Democrats and Republicans alike, was abdication. That they basically outsourced this all to experts so that they could either say that they're standing with the experts or then later blame the experts for decisions that people didn't like. And that's what you saw happen with President Trump and Governor Cuomo and Governor Newsom and Mayor de Blasio and Governor Wolf. You heard Senator Fetterman, who was lieutenant governor of my home state of Pennsylvania at that time, talk about that they were trying to make these decisions. That's what we need to get better at, is understanding how to incorporate expert evidence to develop resiliency plans for infectious disease that basically weigh everything that's going on. And that's the whole story of COVID, is that these politicians did nothing for 2.5 months and then panicked and then used very blunt tools that they're now blaming the scientists for because they expended all that time doing nothing in terms of developing tests, fortifying nursing homes. All of that didn't happen for January, February, and half of March. So then we got put in a situation where New York City hospitals were about to be crushed, and they took advice and basically applied it very bluntly, and now we have kind of the aftermath of all of the political repercussions that happened after that. So that's part of what I think a good hearing would have, talking about origins and talking about how do you ideally do this? How should policymakers take advice from experts when they're trying to formulate a policy?
I have a couple viewers in the live chat asking to hear some of Senator Johnson's remarks right here. So we're going to turn the volume up for a second because we love our viewers and I'll do whatever they need to do.
Intellectual property.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Given that NIH receives royalty payments from certain pharmaceutical companies, why would any American believe these financial ties did not influence decisions about which treatments were promoted or restricted?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Why doesn't NIAID publicly disclose these payments?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you partner with Bill Gates on global health initiatives or vaccines?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
How much did Bill Gates entities provide in funding to NIAID collectively since 2005?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
To your knowledge, did Bill Gates partner with China on sensitive research?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Specifically, dual-use research such as countermeasures or gain of function?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Do you know if Bill Gates' entities partnered with U.S. government classified programs?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Do you know if Bill Gates maintains an active national security clearance?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you advocate or request for Bill Gates to receive a security clearance?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Do you have any knowledge that NIAID or NIH through HHS sponsored or requested a security clearance for Bill Gates?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Around 2010, my understanding is that the government shifted its approach to biodefense countermeasure research. Did NIAID, under your leadership, partner with the Obama White House or any other U.S. government classified entities on sensitive countermeasures research?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did your office take steps to drive biological research investments?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What was private industry's take on the type of research in the 2010 timeframe and before?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Was it considered too dangerous to conduct and industry was hesitant to take this on and invest in?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Why did you take steps to mature the government's approach to biodefense?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Were there any specific lines of effort or actions you felt were needed during this time to improve the research, development, and fielding model?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
How was dual use and gain of function incorporated or accounted for in maturing biodefense countermeasures?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you ever discuss moving gain of function countermeasures research out of government space to private industry space?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
How were these private organizations regulated through government oversight while conducting risky research, including gain of function or gene editing technology?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did the Obama White House or any government entities take steps to inject funding into private industry?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
How do you ensure that our national security and public health is protected when private organizations work with foreign countries of concern and have the no government oversight, such as the EcoHealth Alliance research grant you funded in a CCP military lab?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did given the culture of the pay to play at NIAID, did you or anyone acting on your behalf make any payment or enter any arrangement in any way or fashion to secure influence the broad pardon you received from President Biden?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Department of Energy that confirms during Anthony Fauci's tenure that Bill Gates was given Q security clearance from 2014 to 2021. Without objection, that will be entered into the record. I'd also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the contents of the folder of authorities provided to Dr. Fauci, including the pardon. Let's be clear today, what we've seen. I really did want to hear from Dr. Fauci. I wanted to hear perhaps an apology, perhaps some semblance of being sorry for what happened or that judgment errors were made. We didn't hear any of that. But he was subpoenaed here to testify, refused to answer any questions, even after being directed by the chair and being advised of the law requiring him to do so. He has cited a privilege that is unsupported because of his blanket pardon and because he waived the privilege by testifying at the start. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to comply with the law, limited to the period of your pardon. At any point between January 1st, 2014 and January 19th, 2025, did you destroy any federal record or tell anyone else to?
Under the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Given that you have a unlimited presidential pardon, what is your specific objection that you are making?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
My question was limited to the period of your pardon only. I find your objection unsupported and direct you to answer the question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Because you refuse to answer, citing a privilege that is unsupported because of your pardon, and after being denied to do so, this committee has scheduled a vote next week on a resolution certifying your contempt. I think we have another question or two from Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, really, this is a question for you, and it's a question to try to figure out how do we get a good answer on this? Because clearly Dr. Fauci's attorneys are saying that he has a Fifth Amendment right. We've also subpoenaed him to be able to compel his testimony to be able to be here. I happen to be in the committee. We're also dealing with Lois Lerner. Lois Lerner came and testified, gave an opening statement, and then took the Fifth Amendment. The committee then held her in contempt for that, saying you can't do both. You can't both testify and say I'm not going to answer questions. So the parliamentary question that I think we've got to be able to deal with is this consistent with Lois Lerner? What she also did when she came before Congress, gave an opening statement, testimony, so made a statement, and then refused to answer questions. Are we dealing with the same issue here where someone is you can't make a statement and say, I'm not going to make statements at the same time?
I think it's a very good question. I think that's something all of us will examine over next week. We're going to have a vote next week on contempt. I think there's another legal question that the courts may have to decide upon, and that is whether or not a presidential pardon that offers you complete immunity, that you can still claim that you need protection from immunity when you've been protected. Because Dr. Fauci isn't liable for anything as long as he tells the truth, even if he admits that he destroyed records on a routine basis. His assistant said she destroyed a ton of emails. I think it was a routine thing. I think he destroyed throughout his career there are probably thousands of emails. Even if he did that, as long as he answered truthfully, yes, I did. I didn't think that was important. I made a mistake. You can't be prosecuted for it. Many of the things are outside the statute of limitations as well. All he had to do today, if he wanted to testify, was be honest. As long as he was honest, even about committing a crime, he would have no jeopardy. But I think the pardon has given him more immunity than most people would ever get. Like if you offer a witness immunity in exchange for testimony, he has blanket immunity. The president gave him blanket immunity for virtually anything he could have possibly done, while at NIH. So I think we all have to individually answer this question. We welcome you to be part of helping us figure out the question, but there will be a vote, at least right now, though, we plan to be a vote next week on contempt.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Today will be the capstone to Anthony Fauci's 40 years of abuse of power at NIH. In the end, must imagine Fauci believes he got away with it. But still, late at night, even the guilty must become anxious, rerunning the scenarios through his mind, wondering, latching on to lingering doubts, and worrying. Did his actions lead to the largest man-made plague in human history? Are the millions dead the result of his experiments or experiments that he approved that increased the pathogenicity of deadly viruses? History will judge, but the facts, as we now know them, paint a sordid tale of dishonesty, misjudgment, and ultimately the hubris, the likes of which the world has rarely seen. If everyone will remain seated for a few minutes, we're going to let Dr. Fauci exit. Thank you.
Can you exit out of there? All right, that is the end of what we were hoping was going to be a historic testimony of Dr. Anthony Fauci on Capitol Hill, subpoenaed by Senator Rand Paul, testifying this morning for about 3 hours. He chose to plead the Fifth, as we heard. Thank you guys for watching the live stream with us. I know that was a long one. I think a lot of information didn't come out of it. I am Meagan Medick from NewsNation's Unreported. Today we have with us to deep dive what just happened, Dr. Amesh Adalja. We have Robert Driscoll, legal analyst, former senior DOJ official, and trial lawyer Reagan Charleston Thomas. You guys, thank you for hanging in there. First impressions around the room of what happened today, Amesh.
Again, I think that this is really not anything that advanced our knowledge of COVID pandemic preparedness. And what you saw was basically performative statements by senators that really didn't get us any new knowledge. And I think that there are important questions that need to be answered about COVID. There's important questions to be answered in the debate to be had about gain of function research. There's an important question about how do we prepare for the next infectious disease emergency? What systems need to be in place? But you saw none of that actually addressed there. You saw people kind of trying to scapegoat Dr. Fauci and not really interested in the actual substance of the problem that the NIH, NIAID, CDC was trying to solve, or even to do kind of a biopsy on COVID and understand where things went right, where things went wrong, what new things should be put in place so that you don't repeat the mistakes of COVID. None of that basically happened. This was kind of, and it's not surprising that he invoked the Fifth Amendment. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what the legality of that was, but when the chairman of the committee, senator and a physician, Dr. Paul, has basically said that he wants Dr. Fauci in prison, I don't think you can actually go into that kind of a hearing thinking you're there to be an expert witness to actually help Congress decide how to set up pandemic policy in the future. And so I think it was very disappointing and really a waste of everyone's time.
Well, I also think that the committee really wanted to get to the bottom of gain of function research. What was the United States' role in gain of function research, specifically in Wuhan dealing with coronavirus? There are a lot of allegations that Fauci knew of that. We knew that they said his salary was at that time like $450,000 a year or something. He did say before he decided that he was going to start pleading the Fifth that Rand Paul wants to get me to say anything to get me to end up behind bars. It's an unhinged obsession with me. So we hear this, and then I hear your medical opinion saying, yeah, we did not get to the bottom of anything. We don't know where the pandemic originated. But if you're saying that Dr. Fauci is being used as a scapegoat, who are the correct people for Congress to actually call to get to the bottom of those answers if it's not Dr. Fauci, who was at the top of the food chain at the time?
So it depends upon what aspect of it. If you're talking about the school closures, the lockdowns, the shutdowns of businesses, the people not being able to visit their relatives in the hospital, that falls to governors, mayors. Those are elected officials, and I mentioned this earlier, who need to learn how to take expert advice and adapt it to weigh different aspects of it and decide what the actual policy is going to be. They abdicated on that. So they are the ones that should answer for that. When it comes to gain of function, this was an active debate, and you heard a little bit about it during that hearing in terms of what was going on with bird flu and the moratorium that occurred during the Obama administration relating to taxpayer funding of gain of function, which was then lifted. The fact is that at the time of 2019 and prior, when these grants were going to groups like EcoHealth Alliance, what was called gain of function research, or that type of research where they're trying to change the characteristics of certain pathogens, that was permissible. The key questions are, were certain entities that got NIH funding, were they then awarding subawards to entities in China which might not have been doing that research under the safest conditions? That's an important question, but I don't think you're going to get an answer to that in this type of a setting where people are being told that they're going to go to prison. So I don't necessarily think that if there was a policy lapse there, that gain of function research wasn't being regulated appropriately, or there were mistakes made or lapses made or misappropriation of taxpayer funds. Those are important questions to answer, but I don't think this type of a setting is going to actually give you any kind of an answer to that. And these are important questions because we're still having these debates about gain of function research, because it does provide knowledge that can be useful for pandemic preparedness in certain settings, but it also has to be done safely, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't increase the risk to the general population of an accident or a lab leak happening. But this is not the venue for actually addressing any of that with these props and these senators with their camera moments.
Yeah, well, especially when you add pleading the Fifth in there as well, then we're definitely not getting any answers. Reagan, Senator Hassan, she said the hearing was designed to entrap Fauci. Do you agree with that assessment?
I mean, I agree with Amesh in that the lead up, the preliminary statements made by Senator Rand Paul, preliminary to this. I mean, Dr. Fauci would, fear was a factor here. I mean, he certainly would fear that anything that he could potentially say could open him up to a perjury charge. And I believe that, if he had his dozen attorneys, I think is what they said, advising him on whether or not he should answer questions, given that kind of pre-fight rhetoric, I mean, it's almost like a boxing match where the fighters are just saying whatever before the fight. And you kind of had that narrative and rhetoric from Senator Rand Paul. I mean, it isn't totally surprising and shocking that he would go in and just, have a blanket pleading the fifth standpoint and stance. And I think that, moving forward, if there are to, if we're to seek answers, I think the only possible route to actually getting the answers that, perhaps the American public really truly wants and that we're sitting here talking about today would be for a total grant of immunity. But I still, that is not a possibility. Clearly, we just saw at the end of the hearing, they're going to move forward with contempt. They're going to have a vote, and then ultimately it will fall on the DOJ. It'll be referred, and they can either take it up or they won't, and maybe they will decline. You heard Langston talking about Lois Lerner in that case. And there are a lot of different kind of nuanced issues that need to be examined, but immunity is not the route. And, without that, and perhaps Professor Driscoll can kind of opine here too. I mean, if that is that our only possibility of, really truly hearing from Dr. Fauci and securing this testimony that would be an honest and accurate representation of what's gone on over the last, 7 years. And, I'm not certain of what that really looks like and what the path forward is. And we're going to have to rely on, piecemeal evidence and redacted documents to try and kind of piece things together. I just don't know what it looks like for truth finding moving forward.
And it doesn't seem like there is enough for the DOJ to take this up and to actually get a result that Senator Rand Paul would want, which would be jail Fauci. Professor Driscoll, do you agree?
Well, I mean, I think if the DOJ prosecuted and he was found prosecuted for contempt of Congress, he could conceivably get a short jail sentence a la Bannon and Navarro. I mean, it'd be the identical case. The U.S. Attorney's Office has the documents done. But there is the legal question that Chairman Paul raised about whether or not the pardon is the equivalent of an immunity grant for purposes of kind of eliminating your ability to plead the fifth, and what is the overlap? It's funny, Congress is looking at their own precedent in the Lois Lerner case from years ago. And for people that don't remember or too young, the IRS was accused of politicizing their nonprofit tax designations and essentially delaying or rejecting nonprofit status for conservative groups. And Lois Lerner was kind of the point of that spear within the IRS. She ended up testifying before Congress and gave an opening statement in which she essentially said everything she did was righteous, and then asserted the fifth. And the committee held her in contempt. At that point, there was a referral made. Of course, there was a Democratic administration at the time, so she was never prosecuted. And so, Senator Langford from Oklahoma was kind of asking whether that was the appropriate precedent or not. And so I think we're likely to get litigation out of this because I think that the Senate will, either get a prosecution from DOJ, which has been pretty aggressive. You could see them, Chairman Paul, laying the foundation by asking the very specific questions at the end, carefully limiting his question to the time of the pardon to eliminate any argument that the question was ambiguous and was including time outside the pardon. And so one of his lawyers, the staff lawyers, gave him that cheat sheet to kind of go through that and read. And so I think we're going to get either, there's a couple of different ways this could go. Whether or not there's a contempt motion, you could bring a civil contempt motion to decide the legal issue. there could be a criminal contempt referral that DOJ could try to bring. But I think it's going to be before a court as to whether or not this invocation of the fifth is proper. And I think kind of the irony of it is if people are going to think long term, the politics of this are all going to switch in a couple of years. And so it's going to be very curious to me about how aggressively DOJ would want to go after this case. Because frankly, if I was in President Trump's DOJ and kind of was looking into the future a little bit, I'm not sure how strong I want the precedents to be that you could be held in contempt for not testifying once you've been granted a pardon. Because there's a lot of President Trump.
Because he doesn't want to face that same scrutiny in a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people President Trump has pardoned. I mean, if you think about how, if the Democrats got in power, for example, in the House, the Democratic committees may well want to call a lot of the January 6th participants, ask, who did you take directions from? You know, kind of in the same way the Republicans are arguably relitigating some of the COVID fights, the Democrats are going to want to relitigate some of the January 6th fights and say, okay, where were you getting your information, head of the Proud Boys? Were you communicating with anyone in the White House, head of the Proud Boys? And you have to respond because you have a pardon for all this conduct. And so you have no ability to go forward, and we'll prosecute you if we think you're lying. And so the shoe could completely be on the other foot from a partisan perspective going forward. But I still think this will end up somehow, whether in a civil contempt, criminal contempt, or a straight up prosecution. I think that we will get a decision or to get a referral to a court pretty quickly. And again, that's one of the huge benefits. It's practical. If you represent somebody like Schertler is, the attorney got thrown out. I mean, one of the practical things is if this ends up in court, he's bought time. He's essentially run out this Congress. I mean, it's one of the things in congressional investigations is if it does spawn off litigation, it will take months to brief. It will go to the appeals court and take months. There'll be a fight over whether or not there's a stay. But you can see the light at the end of the tunnel if you are representing a defendant in this. It's money. I'm sure someone's funding him, funding his attorneys. But this delay will go on for a long time. And then if the Senate changes hands, guess what? The subpoena gets withdrawn or the prosecution gets dropped eventually if there's a Democratic administration. And so kind of dragging it out will be interesting for, practicing lawyers and law professors like me and really no one else because the real facts will happen. But I think Congress always has to be careful if they look at these things through two parts in a lens, because you don't have to be in this town long to see things completely flip. And I've been through investigations with Democrats when Republicans are in office, investigations by Republicans when Democrats are in office. And, it's the arguments just switch depending on who the players are. And that'll be this one as well. And I'm hoping that, to me, it'd be nice to get some clarity from the court about whether the pardon does, eliminate. My view is that the better view would be that it does, that you can't plead the fifth, because the entire perjury trap argument I've always been skeptical of, because it's an argument that proves too much, because it would apply literally to everyone. Because you would always be at risk of being prosecuted for a false statement before Congress, regardless of what kind of immunity or anything else you had. And so you would have the ability to thwart, and going back to the Teapot Dome is kind of, one of the first times, scandal, after the Grant administration, one of the first time Congress has litigated this, the Supreme Court has always consistently upheld Congress's ability to compel witnesses in order to be able to do its job. And there's been a great
point that you make about, kind of waiting out the administration to see if it changes hand, because it's very clear from today and every day that the priorities on the right and the left are massively different. A lot of other things were brought up today, a bunch of things from Fauci's diary, and I kind of want to get into a little bit of those. But something specific that was brought up was the vaccines. Dr. Amish, we kind of talked about that a little bit during the hearing about the efficacy of the vaccines. But ivermectin was also brought up today. And this was brought up in a context of, hey, we had this drug. Allegedly, it worked to help stop COVID or make you feel better. And it could have been a replacement for the vaccine, but it was kind of thrown out by the medical community, saying, hey, you can't use that. It was kind of deemed as like a horse pill, etc. Where do we stand on ivermectin today? Looking back, did it work as a potential drug over the vaccine to help with COVID?
No, there's no evidence that ivermectin has any impact on COVID. Ivermectin is an anti-parasitic drug. It works for things like scabies and river blindness. And yes, it was a Nobel Prize winning drug, but it has no role in COVID. When it was actually studied closely, there was no benefit to using it, and it was distracting people away from using things that do work, like the vaccine. And no one ever prohibited anybody from prescribing ivermectin. Doctors could use it, and doctors still use it. They're using it they're using it for anything right now. It's become a tribal symbol that people just say for anything. Hantavirus, Ebola, whatever it is, they just say ivermectin now reflexively. So no, there was no evidence that it worked. Nobody was prohibited from using it. It just was basically a waste of time and a waste of money, and exposed people to unnecessary side effects from ivermectin that they didn't need to be exposed to. And it's now just something that people will clamor to. And when you think about what had the biggest benefit, it was dexamethasone, which is a cheap steroid that wasn't really manufactured by some big company. Ivermectin was made by Merck. And it kind of just blows up their whole narrative that people were favoring branded things versus unbranded things, when dexamethasone became the workhorse for people who were hospitalized and needed oxygen and had major mortality benefits. And I think right now there's just a group of the population that continues to clamor for ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, despite the evidence. They don't actually think that there needs to be any evidence. They just basically say it kind of almost like parrots. And I think that's what you saw people like Senator Johnson doing there.
Reagan, Senator Hawley, also, hard questions today, plead the fifth answer. He really focused on the alleged self-dealings of Fauci, saying that he profited off of the pandemic. Is that a federal crime, as Hawley alleged?
I would have to look at the particular statutory laws that he was referencing. I can't answer that question. It was a very powerful moment, and I'd like to dig into that. Yeah. That was, it was impressive to see the demonstratives and the lists and of these grants and awards that he applied for using federal employees' time and apparently federal dollars. And it certainly sounds like it. But I would have to do some more research into that topic. But it was an emotional moment, and, certainly a piece of the puzzle that I know folks are interested in learning more about.
Yeah, and a lot of other things were brought up from the diary, like him seemingly bragging about his celebrity status. They put up a picture of him from a photo shoot he did for InStyle magazine. Was this, Driscoll, do you think this was a tool just to kind of embarrass him, or was there actually a legal precedent or reasoning for doing this?
Well, I have not been obsessively following Dr. Fauci kind of before this hearing. I mean, obviously I lived through the pandemic and I was aware of some of the complaints about him. I frankly thought, well, there's certainly part of it. I mean, obviously the picture is designed to embarrass him, of him in the sunglasses and some of the references, to his lawyer. I mean, that's kind of a cheap shot. We all know, I think any lawyer would agree, who you hire as a lawyer has nothing to do with your guilt or innocence, simply because your lawyer is representing somebody else who was allegedly a bad person. It has nothing to do with anything. So some of that was obvious grandstanding. But I thought the substantive federal crimes that were kind of discussed, not all the time, but at least some of the time, were kind of, there was more basis and merit to them than I kind of thought going into this. That certainly the destruction of the Federal Records Act, there's a lot of Trump administration people from term one of Trump that got an education on Federal Records Act in NARA with the January 6th committee, where a lot of litigation came up over that and about the ability of the government to hold records and their obligation to keep records. And so those are pretty serious allegations if Fauci was indeed directing others to destroy documents long-term during his time there. I think it was interesting that the money, obviously you can't use your office for private gain. It's probably a little closer when there's an award. The only tell, I agree that I'd want to research it more before I came to a conclusion. The only tell I had was that Senator Hawley cited the Code of Federal Regulation, which is not criminal law. CFRs generally are explaining civil law and civil regulations. And so they do not, usually if there's a true criminal law, they he would have been citing something with a Title 18, in front of it, Title 18 something. And the fact that it was a CFR site, that may be a little more complicated than he let on, but I wouldn't draw a conclusion. But I do think a lot of these, that certainly the requirement to retain documents may well have been violated here. And of course, there may be, false statements that were proven of prior testimony to Congress he's given. But again, none of them can be prosecuted because they were while he was in office and he's got the broad pardon. But I think that to me, while some of it was grandstanding, the Republicans did a good enough job they brought up enough meaty issues that I don't think anyone could complain that it was a completely frivolous exercise, because some of those allegations, if proven out, would be serious enough. I do not view it as a waste of time that senators are looking into, whether or not the head of a major government agency had a longstanding policy of destroying documents. And the indicia from the emails didn't seem great. Seems parallel. Again, there's people in all administrations that have done this. Of, hey, we're going to use our private Gmail. Hey, I'm going to bring this to you outside of work. That's something you see commonly. And again, to draw the January 6th parallel, where it was kind of she was on the other foot investigatively. One of the things that got Meadows in a lot of trouble was he had in one of his text messages, "Let's take this over to Signal." And he was the White House chief of staff, disclosing on his text messages that they're taking something to Signal, which has a disappearing message function. And therefore, if you're using a Signal conversation with the disappearing message function on, you are at risk of a destruction of federal documents charge. And so I think that kind of stuff was legitimate enough for me to think they weren't being frivolous about it. And I think that's why he's asking those harder questions at the end, Chairman Paul, to kind of set that up so that when they litigate it, those questions at the end are the ones we're going to see kind of block quoted in some of the litigation that goes forward from here.
Well, let's get some final thoughts from both of you. Senator Peters said today in this hearing that it was doing more damage. Damage was being caused by holding this hearing. I'm hearing from both of you that there are some legal things coming out of here that maybe be able to move the needle forward, some important things that we could be pinpointing in the future. The committee did say they scheduled a vote for next week. Reagan, final thought from you on looking ahead to the case against Dr. Anthony Fauci.
I agree with Professor Driscoll. I don't find this frivolous exercise at all. We are talking about some very serious issues and acts that, if substantiated, we need to explore. And there should be hearings on this matter. And moving forward, I would hope that some of these kind of nuanced areas, there's some more clarity that we'll find through litigation. And we ended up with some meaty bits of evidence, and issues that we need to discuss. But ultimately, we have more questions than answers now. And that's unfortunate, but I don't find this to be a frivolous exercise at all.
Absolutely. Mr. Driscoll.
No, I agree with that. And I think that it's, again, I felt bad for the doctor today on the panel, because I think that the substance was lacking on that front. But these are important constitutional issues. I know kind of non-lawyers might view them as kind of process-oriented, but I think that it will be helpful to advance the ball in terms of if there is some court decision on how far does the Fifth Amendment go, and if there is a pardon, can you still be compelled? Because there's still public value. You can punish someone for a crime. That's one way of society describing its or implementing its will, that it wants the law to be followed. But public, accountability through a congressional hearing is another way as well, whether or not there's a prosecution. And so there would be real value. I mean, I know we can't get there, but in fantasy world, I think we would all love if you could inject Dr. Fauci with truth serum and just say what really happened.
What happened?
You know what I mean? And just wouldn't it be so great to actually get some honest reflection from someone who's in that such powerful position to say, hey, I really did feel strongly about the masks at the time, and or I really did feel this way about the vaccines or about the shutdowns, but I didn't feel this other way. But I kind of shaded it because I thought we needed to encourage the public to behave the next way. I think that could be a very much a learning experience, and it's not just a criminal prosecution that decides whether someone is right or wrong. And so the inability to get any testimony at all, I think Congress's purpose was thwarted a little bit. It'll be interesting to see if the courts kind of back up Dr. Fauci and his ability to do that, or if they back up Congress. And I think that decision is important, independent of this particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I can guarantee you whatever happens next, we will be following it. We will be covering it. I think the story is very important. Every single person in the world was affected by one way or another by COVID-19. So yes, it would be nice to get some answers. Unfortunately, we did not get that today, but there will be a vote next week and we will see what happens from there. I want to thank everybody for watching the live testimony of Dr. Anthony Fauci with us, the former NIAID director. He testified before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. I am Meagan Medick from Unreported on NewsNation. Thank you, Professor Robert Driscoll, former DOJ senior DOJ official. Dr. Umesh Adalja, he had to go, but thank you so much for your input and your time with us. And Miss Reagan Charleston, Thomas trial lawyer, you guys hanging out with me for over 3.5 hours. I absolutely appreciate your time so much, and let's do it again soon.
Thanks so much.